Part 6. Scaling the Impossible, Model 3 and Starlink, 2017 to 2021. Chapter 51. Model 3 Production Hell, 2017 to 2019. The sleeping bag was on the floor of the Fremont factory, tucked against the wall near one of the Model 3 assembly stations, and it was not a prop. It was not placed there for a photograph or a profile, or to communicate something strategic to the financial press. It was there because Elon Musk had slept in it, on the factory floor, for enough consecutive nights that it had acquired the particular flatness of regular use. And the people who worked the overnight shift had stopped remarking on it the way you stop remarking on furniture. He was there when they arrived. He was there when they left. He moved through the assembly line in the early morning hours with the focused, slightly hollowed look of a man who had compressed sleep into the minimum interval the body would accept, and was running the remainder of his resources on the fuel of a problem that had not yet been solved, and that he had publicly promised to approximately 400,000 reservation holders who had each put down $1,000 against a car that did not yet exist in sufficient quantity to reach them, would be solved on a timeline that the factory floor was currently making no credible argument for. The bags under his eyes were geological. The questions he was asking at 3 in the morning were the same questions he had been asking at 3 in the afternoon, which was the same quality of attention that either drives organizations to extraordinary performance or drives them to exhaustion. And in the Fremont factory during the production hell of 2017 and 2018, it was doing both simultaneously. The Model 3 had been revealed to the public on March 31, 2016, at an event in Hawthorne that Musk had staged with the showmanship of someone who understood that the reveal was not just a product launch, but an argument. An argument that electric vehicles were not a luxury category or an ideological statement, but a democratic technology available to the family that had been watching the Model S from a respectful distance and waiting for the version they could actually afford. The car that appeared on stage was clean and purposeful, and deliberately unflashy, priced at $35,000 before incentives, and the response was unlike anything the automotive industry had previously generated from a single product announcement. In the 24 hours following the reveal, Tesla received 180,000 reservations. Within a week, the number exceeded 325,000. Within a month, it approached 400,000. The deposits represented approximately $400 million in committed customer interest, and an obligation so public and so quantified that it functioned as a different kind of pressure than any investor or analyst or board could apply. The pressure of ordinary people who had decided to trust a promise and whose patience was now a resource being consumed in real time. The world watching this unfold in 2017 was a world in which Tesla's cultural position had achieved a kind of unstable altitude, high enough that the expectations attached to it were no longer commensurate with the operational reality of a company that was, beneath its extraordinary market valuation, still a relatively young manufacturer with a single main production facility, a supply chain that had been stress-tested by the Model X and found expensive, and a manufacturing workforce that was being scaled at a rate human resources systems struggled to manage under the best conditions. The broader electric vehicle market was beginning to show the first signs of the transformation that Musk had spent 15 years predicting. Volkswagen had announced its intention to electrify its entire lineup following the Dieselgate scandal that had cost the company billions in penalties and had demolished whatever remained of the internal combustion engine's moral credibility in European markets. General Motors had released the Bolt, a genuinely capable electric vehicle at a competitive price point. The incumbents were moving, which was validation of the thesis, and simultaneously the first intimation that the window in which Tesla could claim the electric vehicle market without serious competition from organizations with vastly greater manufacturing experience was beginning to close. The Model 3 needed to reach its customers not just to honor the reservation commitments, but to establish Tesla's mass market position before the established automakers completed their own transitions and arrived at the same price points with the benefit of a century of production expertise. The specific nature of the production failure that consumed 2017 and the first half of 2018 was, in its technical dimensions, a story about the limits of automation, about what happens when a manufacturing philosophy that treats human labor as a variable to be minimized encounters the irreducible complexity of assembling a physical object at high speed and high volume. Musk had, in the design of the Model 3's production system, pushed the automation thesis further than any previous automotive application had taken it. The vision was a factory that operated at speeds and with a consistency that human-executed processes could not match, robots performing every step of the assembly with the tireless precision of machines running optimized programs. The vision was coherent, and the ambition was real, and the execution revealed, with a thoroughness that was almost pedagogical in its completeness, the current limits of robotic assembly in an environment as physically complex as automobile manufacturing. The battery module assembly line, located partly at the Gigafactory in Nevada and partly at the Fremont plant, became the primary bottleneck in a system whose bottlenecks were numerous and mutually reinforcing. The automated systems for handling and assembling the battery cells and modules had been specified to run at rates that the equipment could not consistently sustain under production conditions. Sensors failed. Conveyors jammed. Quality control systems flagged parts at rates that overwhelmed the rework capacity downstream. Each stoppage on one section of the line propagated backward through the system with the logic of a queue, vehicles accumulating at the block station while the stations upstream continued their work until they too ran out of space and stopped. And the measured output at the end of the line, the number that mattered, the cars per week that Tesla had promised investors and customers, remained stubbornly, humiliatingly below the targets that had been announced with such confidence from the stage in Hawthorne. The production rate in the third quarter of 2017 was 260 Model 3 vehicles. The target had been 1,500 per week by end of year. The target became 1,500 per week by the first quarter of 2018. The target became 2,500 per week by end of Q1 2018. Each revision arrived with explanatory context and forward guidance that was constructed to maintain investor confidence in the trajectory while acknowledging the current distance from it, a form of communication that required a specific and taxing calibration, honest enough to maintain credibility, optimistic enough to prevent the collapse of the stock price that would have triggered the death spiral of a capital raise under duress. Musk managed this calibration with the skill of someone who had done it before, during the near-death experiences of 2008, but the scale of the current exposure was larger, and the scrutiny more intense and the short sellers more organized and more vocal than anything the previous crises had involved. The decision that stands as this chapter's keyhole into Musk's character, the choice that reveals something essential about how he operates when a system he has designed is failing, and the failure is public and the cost of continued failure is existential, was the decision to dismantle the automated battery module assembly line and replace it with a human-operated line built under a tent in the Fremont parking lot. It was not a decision made in a planning session or a board review. It was a decision made by a man who had spent enough consecutive nights on a factory floor to understand, with the empirical directness that physical proximity provides, that the automated system was not going to reach the required rate on any timeline that the company's cash position could accommodate. He had been wrong about the automation thesis, or at least he had been wrong about its timeline, and being wrong in the specific context of a public commitment to 400,000 waiting customers was not a condition he could deliberate about indefinitely. The tent went up. The human assembly line went in. Engineers who had been programming robots were reassigned to managing workers. The system that was supposed to represent the future of manufacturing was bypassed by the system it had been designed to replace, and the production rate, measured the following week and the week after that, began to move toward the targets that the robots had failed to reach. The tent was not a retreat from the automation vision. Musk framed it, and the framing was accurate, as a tactical recognition that the bottleneck required a different tool at this point in time, that the automated system would eventually be optimized to outperform the human line, but that eventually was a category the company's cash runway did not currently contain. It was also, viewed honestly, an acknowledgement of something he had told reporters he had learned from the Model X's over-engineering, that complexity introduced at the wrong moment in a production ramp is paid for in ways that schedules and projections do not capture until the line is running and the invoice arrives. Gwynne Shotwell was not a Tesla figure, But her influence on Musk's operational thinking during this period was significant in the oblique way that the people who manage one of his organizations sometimes illuminate his management of the others. Shotwell, SpaceX's president and chief operating officer, had spent 15 years developing a managerial vocabulary for working with Musk's particular combination of visionary direction and operational impatience, a vocabulary built on the understanding that his declarations of timeline were genuine expressions of his desired state rather than reliable predictions of the achievable state, and that the gap between those two things was the space in which her work primarily lived. She had learned, with a precision that few people in his orbit achieved, how to push back on him in the register that he could hear, not the register of caution or institutional conservatism, which he processed as failure of nerve and dismissed accordingly, but the register of technical argument and operational consequence, the frame in which the question was not whether the goal was correct, but whether the specific path to it would arrive there faster than the alternative. Her model of managing him was, in the accounts of people who had observed both organizations, something that Tesla's operational leadership had not consistently replicated. And the production hell of 2017 and 2018 was partly a story about what the absence of that specific competency in the right positions costs a company being driven at SpaceX velocity. By June of 2018, Tesla was producing 5,000 Model 3 vehicles per week, the target that had been the original end of 2017 goal. Achieved 6 months late and at a human and financial cost that the quarterly reports would document over the following years. Musk emerged from the production hell period with the gaunt, slightly post-crisis appearance of someone who had been through something that did not leave the body cleanly. And he acknowledged in subsequent interviews that the experience had been the most painful of his professional life, surpassing even the near collapses of 2008 in the specific quality of its sustained, daily, unrelenting demand on every resource he possessed. He had been wrong about the robots. He had slept on a factory floor for months. He had made public promises that the production system had made him look foolish for making. And he had gotten the line running, which was the only measure that ultimately mattered in the binary accounting system by which he evaluated outcomes. The Model 3 that reached its customers in the second half of 2018 was received with a response that the production ordeal had made genuinely moving. Reservation holders who had waited 2 years and watched the deadline move, and who had maintained their deposits through revisions that would have caused less committed customers to defect, taking delivery of a car that was, by the consensus of the automotive press, one of the finest vehicles at its price point regardless of powertrain. The reviews were not as rapturous as the Model S reviews had been, because the Model S had arrived with the force of a revelation, and the Model 3 arrived with the weight of expectation. And those are different conditions under which to be evaluated. But the car was good, and the customers loved it, and the production rate that had seemed impossible in January of 2018 was being met by July, and the financial trajectory that the rate enabled began to suggest for the first time in Tesla's history that the company might generate sustained positive cash flow without requiring another emergency capital raise. What the production hell had also generated, in the months of pressure and sleep deprivation and public exposure that Musk had spent inside it, was a set of behaviors and communications that had introduced a different kind of risk into the company's situation. A risk not from the factory floor but from the communications that had emerged from it, from a man under extreme stress with a Twitter account and a complicated relationship with the regulatory expectations that govern the public statements of a chief executive whose company's stock is among the most actively traded and most heavily shorted in the market. And the specific and consequential collision between those factors was already assembling itself into a crisis that the production rate, however much it had improved, could do nothing to prevent. Chapter 52. The Fremont Tent. The smell hit you before the noise did. It was the particular combination of industrial sealant, aluminum shavings, and something close to burning ambition, the scent of a factory that had never quite been designed to do what it was now being asked to do. On the floor of the Fremont assembly plant in the summer of 2018, the air was thick with the voltage of crisis. Robotic arms swung overhead with mechanical indifference. Workers in Tesla red vests moved between stations with the compressed urgency of people who had been awake too long and were afraid to say so. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, usually distinguishable from the engineers clustered around him by the fact that he was the one everyone else was watching, stood Elon Musk, shirt untucked, eyes scanning the line with the expression of a man doing mathematics in his head that nobody else in the room could follow. He had slept on that floor. Not metaphorically. A thin foam pad tucked beside a line of stamping machines, the kind of accommodation that no CEO in American industry had claimed for themselves since the rough-hewn frontier days of the railroad barons. When reporters asked whether this was theater, a performance staged for the workforce, a signal meant to be retransmitted, those who knew Musk well shook their heads. The sleeping bag was real. The exhaustion was real. And the terror, though he would never have called it that, was absolutely, vertiginously real. The target was 5,000 Model 3 sedans per week. That number had begun to take on the quality of myth inside Tesla, a number that had been promised to investors, repeated in earnings calls, inscribed in the internal consciousness of the company as the threshold between existence and annihilation. By the spring of 2018, Tesla was producing barely a quarter of that. And the world, it felt to Musk, had begun to circle. To understand what was happening inside Fremont that summer, you have to understand what was happening outside it. The American economy in 2018 was humming with the peculiar confidence of a late expansion cycle. Unemployment low, markets elevated, the tech sector draped in the lavish self-satisfaction of a decade's uninterrupted growth. But beneath that confidence ran a current of anxiety about the future of work, the future of energy, and whether the institutions that had organized American life for a century, the automobile industry above all, were capable of reinventing themselves in time to meet it. Tesla, to its supporters, was not merely a car company. It was a proof of concept for the proposition that American manufacturing could be reimagined from the ground up, that the old orthodoxies of Detroit could be discarded without consequence. That belief had produced what became known, in the clinical terminology of postmortems, as the production hell. The original sin was one that Musk, in retrospect, acknowledged with the directness he typically reserved for confessions that no longer cost him anything. He had over-automated. The vision he had carried into the Model 3 launch was one in which the factory would function as a kind of machine that built machines, robots performing tasks that had historically required human hands, with a speed and consistency that humans simply could not match. The assembly line, as he had conceived it, was to be his masterpiece of industrial design. Instead, it became his greatest manufacturing humiliation. The robots jammed. They misaligned. They moved with a precision that was admirable in laboratory conditions, and catastrophic on a live production floor where the tolerances of reality refused to cooperate with the tolerances of the design spec. The battery module assembly line, in particular, had been engineered to a degree of automation that proved in practice to be its own undoing. Musk would later tell CBS News that he had made a mistake, that excessive automation had been Tesla's enemy, that the human hand and the human eye possessed a contextual intelligence that no robotic system he had built could yet replicate. The admission, coming from a man constitutionally resistant to the vocabulary of failure, carried the weight of something genuinely painful. The tent was the answer that nobody in traditional manufacturing would have proposed. In May of 2018, with the 5,000-unit target still a distant ridge, Musk authorized the construction of a general assembly structure in the parking lot of the Fremont factory, a semi-transparent white structure that the press would quickly christen with the affectionate mockery that had become the default register for reporting on Tesla, the tent. It was not, technically, a tent in any rigorous sense of the word. It was a sprung structure, the kind used at large outdoor events, repurposed with extraordinary speed and at considerable expense as a functional automobile assembly facility. Inside, a new production line was assembled with a directness of approach that bypassed the architectural deliberation that would have governed any comparable decision at Ford or General Motors. Columns were erected. Conveyors were installed. The entire structure, from authorization to operation, was completed in weeks. Those weeks were among the most ferocious in Tesla's history. Musk was everywhere, and everywhere at once, in a way that defied the conventional geometry of executive oversight. He would appear on the line at 2 a.m, ask a technician a question about a specific weld, receive an answer he considered insufficiently precise, and stand there, physically immovably, until a better answer emerged. His presence was not the inspirational theater of a leader making rounds to boost morale. It was the forensic attention of an engineer who believed, with the conviction of a man who had staked everything on the belief, that the only way to solve a problem was to be inside the problem. He would ask questions that nobody else thought to ask, recalled one engineer who worked the line that summer. And sometimes those questions were genius, and sometimes they were crazy, and sometimes you couldn't tell the difference until 3 days later. The workforce he was driving had reached, by multiple accounts, the outer boundary of what human beings could sustain. Tesla employees during the production hell were routinely working 12-hour shifts, 6 and 7 days a week. The company's injury rate, examined later by investigative journalists and OSHA records, was notably above industry averages. Workers told reporters of fainting on the line, of injuries attributed to overexertion, of a culture in which raising concerns about safety could feel professionally dangerous. Musk's response to these accounts was characteristically combative. He disputed the statistics, challenged the methodology, and argued that injury metrics at Tesla were being calculated in ways that made them incomparable to industry norms. What was harder to dispute was the intensity. That much everyone agreed on. It was during this period that Musk delivered one of the most revealing statements of his professional life, a remark that functioned less as a defense of his management style than as a window into the cosmology that had always organized his decision-making. Asked about the conditions inside Tesla, about the demands being placed on workers who had not signed up to sleep on factory floors or surrender their weekends to a quarterly production target, Musk answered with a simplicity that unsettled people more than any elaboration could have. "There is no mission more important," he said. He was not, in his own framework, asking people to suffer for a company. He was asking them to participate in something he genuinely believed was civilizationally necessary, the acceleration of the world's transition to sustainable energy, and in that framing the suffering was not incidental. It was the price of significance. The man who had come to embody the counterweight to this philosophy, the human cost behind the mission statement, was Doug Field, Tesla's head of engineering, who departed the company in the spring of 2018 at the precise moment when the production hell had reached its most ferocious intensity. Field was, by all accounts, an engineer of genuine talent, a man who had come from Apple with the credibility and the calm that the organization desperately needed. His departure, officially described as a leave of absence that quietly became permanent, said something about the friction between what Tesla required of its people and what its people were capable of sustaining. Musk publicly thanked him and moved on. But insiders noted the timing. Field had been one of the few executives capable of translating between Musk's demands and the engineering organization's capacity to meet them. With Field gone, that translation, already imperfect, became harder still. The relationship that mattered most during those months, the one that shaped the texture of daily life inside Fremont in ways that no organizational chart could capture, was the one between Musk and the line workers themselves. Not any individual, but the collective, the anonymous mass of human effort that was actually building the cars. Musk had a talent, documented by those who observed him at his best, for engaging directly with engineers and technicians, for asking the right question of the right person, and then actually listening to the answer. On the production floor, during the worst of the production hell, this talent sometimes surfaced in striking ways. Workers who had expected a distant executive found instead a man who wanted to know, specifically, what was wrong with the fourth station on the third line, and who would not leave until he understood the answer. For some, this was galvanizing. For others, it was simply exhausting. The line between inspiration and intimidation in Musk's presence was rarely clear. By the end of June 2018, Tesla produced 5,027 Model 3 vehicles in a single week. The tent had worked. The number had been reached. Musk sent a note to employees that vibrated with the relief of a man who had lived inside a possibility for so long that its realization felt even to him slightly unreal. "We did it," he wrote, with the economy of someone who did not trust himself to say more without saying too much. The financial world took notice. Tesla's survival had never been, in the analysis of its skeptics, a foregone conclusion. The company had burned through cash at rates that kept short sellers in a state of permanent anticipation, waiting for the moment when the mathematics of liquidity would finally overwhelm the mathematics of belief. The production milestone did not silence them. Short interest in Tesla remained through 2018, at extraordinary levels, representing one of the largest short positions in the history of American equities, but it shifted the argument. The question was no longer whether Tesla could make cars. The question was whether it could make money making them. The tent, in the years that followed, became something between a symbol and a story, retold at business schools, as an example of scrappy improvisation triumphing over institutional orthodoxy, held up by Musk's admirers as evidence that radical impatience had its own operational logic, cited by his critics as proof that a company willing to build a car factory in a parking lot was a company that would always prioritize spectacle over sustainability. All of these readings contained some portion of the truth. What they missed was the emotional texture of the thing, the specific character of a man who could sleep on a factory floor not because he was indifferent to comfort, but because he was genuinely incapable of being anywhere other than where the problem was. There is something almost medieval in that instinct, something that belongs more to the blacksmith who will not leave his forge until the blade is right, than to the modern executive trained to delegate and review. Musk had built, over the course of his career, organizations of extraordinary sophistication. But inside those organizations he remained, stubbornly and sometimes destructively, a craftsman who did not believe the work was being done correctly, unless he could see it with his own eyes. The tent came down, eventually. The parking lot was reclaimed. The Model 3 went on to become the best-selling electric vehicle in the history of the world, a genuine mass-market product that put Tesla on a financial trajectory no one, not its investors, not its employees, not Musk himself, had been certain it would reach. By the measures that matter most in the biography of a company, the production hell had ended in triumph. But the habits of mind that had built the tent, the furious impatience, the contempt for institutional caution, the willingness to impose unlimited demands on the people around him in service of a timeline that existed primarily inside his own head, those had not come down with the structure. They had, if anything, been validated by it. And high above the California coast, in a series of clean rooms where engineers were assembling the first operational satellites for a network that Musk intended to wrap around the entire planet, those habits were already finding a new and vastly larger theater in which to play. Chapter 53. Sleeping on the factory floor. The foam pad was perhaps 2 inches thick. It sat wedged between a support column and a rack of pneumatic tools, close enough to the assembly line that a man lying on it could hear, even through the compressed hours of something approximating sleep, the rhythmic percussion of the stamping machinery, that deep metronomic thud that the workers on the floor had long since stopped hearing, the way you stop hearing traffic when you live near a highway. Elon Musk had not yet stopped hearing it. He lay there, in the specific posture of a man who has not fully surrendered to sleep, because some part of him refuses to believe the factory will behave correctly without his supervision, one arm folded beneath his head, the other resting across his chest with the stillness of a man who has trained himself to be ready instantaneously to stand up. The workers who passed him on their way to the next shift did not, for the most part, stop. Some glanced. A few took photographs that would circulate later on social media, with captions oscillating between admiration and bewilderment. Most simply moved around him, the way you move around any fixed obstacle on a factory floor, with the automatic efficiency of people who have other problems to think about. He was the richest man none of them had ever spoken to, sleeping on the floor of his own factory, and the strangeness of that image contained in concentrated form everything that was both magnificent and disturbing about what Tesla had become under his leadership. The summer of 2018 was, by any reasonable measure, one of the more turbulent seasons in American public life. The political atmosphere in the United States had achieved a kind of permanent low-grade fever, the daily churn of the Trump administration producing a news cycle so compressed and volatile that events which would have dominated a previous era for weeks were displaced within hours. The culture had fractured into warring epistemologies, each with its own preferred facts, its own prophets, its own definition of what constituted seriousness. In the technology sector, the mood had shifted perceptibly from the evangelical optimism of the early decade toward something more complicated, a dawning recognition, still uncomfortable, still contested, that the platforms and companies that had promised to improve the human condition had also produced surveillance capitalism, algorithmic radicalization, and a species of wealth concentration that the Gilded Age might have recognized. Musk existed in this environment as a singularly ambiguous figure. To his supporters, he was the one technology entrepreneur who was building things, physical, material, tangible things that moved through the world and changed it, rather than engineering behavioral modification at scale. To his critics, he was something more troubling, a man who had cultivated a messianic public persona so effectively that his workforce had internalized his priorities as their own, sacrificing their bodies and their time on the altar of his vision without fully examining whose vision it actually was. The production hell had entered its most critical phase. The 5,000-unit weekly target still hovered, unreached, at the edge of possibility, and Musk had responded to its elusiveness the way he always responded to obstacles that refused to yield to intelligence and money alone, by increasing his own physical presence until the obstacle had nowhere to hide. He had essentially moved into the factory. His Bel Air home sat largely vacant. His jet, the one that flight tracking enthusiasts monitored with the obsessive fidelity of ornithologists logging a rare species, was grounded more often than it flew. The factory was his address, the assembly line his landscape, the foam pad his bedroom. This was not, it bears emphasizing, a performance calibrated for public consumption. Musk's sleeping arrangements at Fremont were not announced in a press release or leaked to a sympathetic journalist. They emerged, the way most true things about Musk emerged, through the accumulated testimony of the people who were there. Engineers who stepped over the foam pad on their way to morning shift, assistants who brought him coffee before the building had fully woken, workers who looked up from a station at 3 a.m. and found him standing there watching, thinking, formulating a question nobody had thought to ask. The obstacle Musk faced during this period was not, at its deepest level, a manufacturing problem. Manufacturing problems are, in principle, solvable. They yield to engineering, to iteration, to the application of sufficient intelligence and sufficient resources over sufficient time. The obstacle Musk faced was something more intimate and more intractable, the collision between his own model of human capacity and the actual limits of the human beings he was asking to operate at that capacity indefinitely. He had always believed, with a sincerity that made it impossible to dismiss as mere exploitation, that the people around him were capable of more than they thought they were, that the limits individuals placed on their own effort were, in most cases, cognitive rather than physical habits of self-protection masquerading as hard ceilings. His own life was, to him, the proof of this proposition. He had built 2 companies simultaneously, while raising children, and managing a public profile of extraordinary complexity. He had slept less, worked more, and absorbed more stress than almost any other human being of his generation, and he was still standing. The foam pad was not, in his own interior narrative, an act of self-sacrifice. It was simply what the situation required. The problem was the distance between his experience and everyone else's. There was an engineer. His name appears in contemporaneous accounts, but he requested in later interviews to be identified only by his role, who had been with Tesla since the early Model S days, one of the original believers, a man whose technical ability had made him indispensable through 2 product launches and 3 rounds of layoffs. During the summer of 2018, this engineer was working what he later estimated as between 80 and 90 hours a week. He had a child who had recently begun walking. He had not been present for the first steps. He had watched them on his phone, on a video his wife had sent at 11 in the morning on a Tuesday, while standing next to a conveyor belt that was refusing to synchronize correctly with the robot arm downstream. He did not quit. Not then. He stayed, driven by the specific loyalty that Musk had always generated in his best people, a loyalty that was not merely to the man but to the idea, to the belief that what they were building together was genuinely worth the sacrifice. "You couldn't leave," he said later, with the mixture of pride and grief that characterizes people describing formative experiences that cost them something they can't get back. Not because of fear. Because you actually believed it mattered. This was Musk's most complex talent, and his most consequential flaw, and in the summer of 2018 they were indistinguishable from each other. He was, in his genuine and unperformed conviction, building something that mattered. The mission was real. The urgency was real. The belief that every week of delay was a week in which the world continued burning fossil fuels, and heating incrementally toward a threshold of irreversible damage. That belief was not a manipulation. It was, to Musk, simply the truth, and the foam pad on the factory floor was his way of putting his body where his conviction lived. But conviction at that temperature is its own form of force. And force, applied without modulation to people who cannot simply choose to be Elon Musk, produces fractures. The fracture that best illuminates the character of the man during this period arrived not in a confrontation or a dismissal, but in a meeting, one of the late-night sessions that had become the primary unit of decision-making at Fremont during the crunch. A group of engineers had gathered to discuss a persistent problem on one of the Model 3 production lines, a misalignment in the battery pack installation that was producing a rejection rate well above acceptable tolerance. The meeting had been running for an hour when Musk asked a question about the torque specification on a particular fastener. A senior engineer provided the figure. Musk looked at him for a moment with the expression that his employees had learned to read, with the precision of meteorologists reading a barometer. The expression that meant he had already done the calculation, and the calculation did not agree with what he had just been told. "That's wrong," Musk said. The engineer, who had been working this specific problem for 11 days on 4 hours of sleep, looked back at him. "I've verified it 3 times, he said. What followed was not, by the standards of Musk's most volcanic moments, an explosion. It was quieter than that, and in some ways more unnerving. Musk simply continued looking at the engineer, then looked at the spec sheet on the table, then looked back. "Verify it again," he said. "Tonight." The engineer verified it again that night. The original figure was correct. Musk acknowledged this the next morning with a nod that contained no apology and no elaboration, and moved on to the next problem. The engineer in question remained with Tesla for another 8 months before departing for a company in the aerospace sector. Whether the exchange was the cause, the final straw, or simply one tile in a larger mosaic of exhaustion, he declined to say. What the exchange reveals is something important about the specific character of Musk's leadership during the production hell. He was not, in the classical sense of the word, a tyrant. He was not capricious, did not punish people for reasons unrelated to the work, did not cultivate a court of flatterers. His demands were, almost without exception, demands that were directly traceable to the mission. Verify it again meant, in his internal language, "I cannot afford to be wrong, and neither can you, and neither can this company." The problem was that this logic, sound in the abstract, did not account for the possibility that the people being asked to verify things again were running on reserves that were no longer replenishing themselves. Gwynne Shotwell, his president and chief operating officer at SpaceX, who had worked alongside Musk long enough to have developed the particular fluency of someone who has survived and studied a force of nature, once described his mode of engagement with exceptional precision. "He doesn't see the effort," she observed. "He sees the gap between where things are and where they should be, and the gap is the only thing that feels real to him." The compassion she was gesturing toward, the compassion for the effort itself, independent of whether the effort was sufficient, was, she implied, not something that came naturally to him. It had to be supplemented by the people around him, who could see what he could not. At SpaceX, Shotwell provided some of that supplementation. At Tesla, during the production hell, the organizational layer between Musk's demands and the workforce's capacity was thinner, and the consequences of its thinness were visible in the turnover numbers. Tesla's executive suite, during 2017 and 2018, experienced a rate of departure that would have constituted a crisis at any conventional company. Chief Accounting Officer Dave Morton lasted a single month. Human resources executives, legal executives, communications executives, the attrition moved through the organizational chart with the systematic thoroughness of a pressure system moving through a weather map. Those who stayed did so for reasons that were, in their own telling, fundamentally similar to the engineer who had watched his child's first steps on a phone screen beside a malfunctioning conveyor belt. They stayed because they believed. The mission had colonized their sense of purpose so completely that the cost of staying had become, in their internal accounting, simply what belief required. This was, simultaneously, the most powerful thing Musk had ever built, an organization of genuine believers, and its most unstable structural element, because belief of that intensity is not renewable on demand. It burns, and it burns brightly, and eventually for most people it burns out. The 5,000-unit week, when it finally arrived, at the very end of June 2018, produced in Musk something that the people around him described carefully as relief rather than joy. He sat in a chair on the production floor, an actual chair, not the foam pad, and said very little for a long time. He had achieved what he had said he would achieve. He had put his body on the line, in the most literal sense available to a man who did not build with his hands, and the line had held. The foam pad was rolled up and carried away. The workers who had built those 5,027 cars went home, most of them, to families and beds, and the ordinary recuperative rituals of human beings who have been running too hard for too long. Musk went to a meeting. In the weeks that followed the production milestone, as Tesla's stock responded and the financial press recalibrated its narrative of the company from likely casualty to unlikely survivor, something had already shifted in the internal climate of Fremont that the quarterly reports would not capture and the earnings calls would not address, a residue of exhaustion and ambivalence in the workforce that had delivered the miracle, a complicated feeling about what they had given and what they had received in return that would not fully surface, until the questions got harder and the asks got bigger, and a new set of workers who had not been there for the tent and the foam pad and the 5,000-unit week were asked to believe with the same totality as those who had. And north of Fremont, in Hawthorne, California, in a factory that bore Musk's other name and contained his other obsession, the first mass-production Starlink satellites were being loaded into a fairing that would carry them into low Earth orbit on a trajectory that would, if everything went as Musk intended, one day encircle every human being on the planet, whether they wanted encircling or not. Chapter 54. Model Y and Global Gigafactory Expansion. The rendering was still on the screen when Musk walked into the room. It showed a building, though building felt like an inadequate word for it, the way pond feels inadequate when you mean ocean. The Gigafactory Shanghai, as rendered in the architectural visualization rotating slowly on the monitor, was a structure of such lateral enormity that the human figures included for scale appeared almost insultingly small, stick figures borrowed from a safety manual and dropped, unaware, at the base of something that belonged to a different order of magnitude than they did. Musk stood in front of it for a moment, with his hands in his pockets. Then he leaned forward, slightly, the way he always leaned when he was doing arithmetic that the room couldn't see, and said, "It should be bigger." The engineers exchanged the particular glance, a lateral flicker, barely a movement, containing an entire conversation, of people who have been through this before. The exchange was not unusual. What was unusual, in the context of Musk's career, and in the context of what the global automotive industry had believed possible until approximately the moment he proved otherwise, was that when he said it should be bigger, he meant it would be bigger, and that the gap between those two verbs, should and will, had always been, for Musk, negligible. He closed distances between the desired and the actual the way other people closed browser tabs, with the brisk, unapologetic efficiency of someone who has decided the previous state of affairs is no longer acceptable. By early 2020, that distance had closed in ways that his competitors were still struggling to process. The world into which the Model Y arrived was a world in the process of being fundamentally reordered, though the full dimensions of the reordering were not yet visible to everyone who was living through it. The pandemic had not yet broken over the United States with its full force when Tesla unveiled the Model Y in March 2019, but by the time the vehicle reached meaningful production volumes in 2020, the world had transformed in ways that created, paradoxically, both the worst and the best possible conditions for what Tesla was attempting to do. Supply chains that had been treated for decades as permanent infrastructure revealed themselves as fragile assemblies of trust and proximity. Semiconductor shortages that had been gestating in the background of the global technology economy suddenly moved to the foreground with violent speed. Ports clogged. Logistics networks buckled. The automobile industry, which had spent 30 years optimizing for just-in-time manufacturing, with the serene confidence of people who have never seen the system fail, found itself staring into a production abyss. Tesla was not immune to any of this. But it was, by the nature of what it had built and the instincts of the man who had built it, more capable of adapting than its legacy competitors. Musk had always maintained a certain contempt for the just-in-time orthodoxy, not an ideological contempt exactly, but the practical skepticism of someone who had watched systems fail under pressure often enough to distrust any architecture that depended on everything going right. SpaceX had learned, through the hard tuition of exploding rockets, to internalize its supply chain wherever possible, to manufacture components in-house that other aerospace contractors had long since outsourced to the lowest bidder. Tesla had absorbed something of the same philosophy. The Model Y was, in its conception, an exercise in a kind of strategic humility that Musk did not often practice, but that the post-production hell reality had made inescapable. Where the Model 3 had been designed with the ambition of a man reinventing the automobile from first principles, the Model Y was designed with the wisdom, partial, hard-won, and somewhat grudging, of a man who had learned what reinvention costs. It shared roughly 75% of its components with the Model 3. The platform was familiar. The manufacturing processes were known quantities. The production ramp, when it came, would be fast, faster than anything Tesla had previously managed, precisely because Musk had, for perhaps the first time in his automotive career, chosen inheritance over invention. This was not a comfortable choice for someone whose identity was so thoroughly organized around the proposition that the existing way of doing things was wrong. But it was, by the measures that actually mattered, unit economics, production velocity, customer satisfaction, and ultimately survival, the correct one. The Model Y became, within 2 years of launch, the best-selling vehicle of any kind in multiple global markets. Not the best-selling electric vehicle. The best-selling vehicle. The core conflict of this chapter in Tesla's story was not, despite appearances, about cars at all. It was about space, physical space, geographic space, the question of where on the surface of the Earth Tesla would build the factories that would determine whether its dominance was a moment or a movement. Shanghai was first, and Shanghai was revelatory. Musk had wanted a Chinese factory for reasons that were simultaneously strategic and existential. China represented the largest automobile market in the world, and by the second decade of the 21st century, the most consequential battleground in the global transition to electric vehicles. Operating in China without local manufacturing meant operating under crippling tariffs, meant ceding price competitiveness to domestic manufacturers who were moving faster than the Western automotive press had been willing to acknowledge, meant treating the world's most important market as an export destination rather than a home. This was not, for a company with Tesla's ambitions, a sustainable posture. What made Shanghai remarkable was not the ambition. Ambition was Musk's baseline, but the speed. The Gigafactory Shanghai broke ground in January 2019. It produced its first vehicles for employees by the end of that same year. Within 18 months of breaking ground, it was manufacturing Model 3 vehicles for Chinese customers at a rate that made the Fremont production hell look, in retrospect, like a useful dress rehearsal. The construction timeline shattered every precedent in the automotive industry. A factory of that scale, by the conventions of the industry Musk was disrupting, required 3 to 4 years to build, and another 1 to 2 years to ramp to meaningful production. Tesla Shanghai achieved in months what Detroit would have scheduled for years. The speed was partly a function of the Chinese government's cooperation. Local authorities in Shanghai had moved with uncommon urgency to clear regulatory pathways, extend favorable financing, and expedite construction approvals in ways that reflected both China's desire to accelerate its domestic EV ecosystem and its recognition that Tesla's presence conferred a legitimacy on that ecosystem that no domestic brand could yet provide. Musk, characteristically, acknowledged this cooperation with the directness of someone who saw no reason to pretend that political relationships didn't shape industrial outcomes. He praised Chinese manufacturing capability with an enthusiasm that some of his American critics found uncomfortable, noting that the Shanghai factory's construction demonstrated the speed and quality that he believed American bureaucratic and regulatory systems would have made impossible. This observation, accurate as it happened, and later confirmed by the considerably more painful experience of building Gigafactory Berlin, contained within it a tension that would grow louder in the years ahead, the tension between Musk's American identity, his positioning as the avatar of a specifically American industrial renaissance, and his increasing operational dependence on and admiration for Chinese manufacturing culture. The tension was not, in 2020, yet a crisis. But it was a fault line. Berlin arrived next, and Berlin arrived the way most things arrive in Germany, with rigorous documentation, extensive environmental review, and a timeline that communicated politely but firmly that urgency was not the primary value being optimized. Musk broke ground on Gigafactory Berlin in 2019 with the announcement that the factory would be producing vehicles by 2021. This proved, despite every effort and every unit of pressure Musk could bring to bear, to be optimistic in the specific way that all of his timelines were optimistic, rooted in a genuine belief that the obstacles other people found insurmountable were simply problems that had not yet been attacked with sufficient ferocity. The German regulatory apparatus, it turned out, was not susceptible to ferocity. Environmental groups filed injunctions. Water usage assessments triggered review processes that triggered further review processes. Local communities raised concerns about traffic and noise, and the ecological character of the Brandenburg forest in which the factory site was located. Each concern was legitimate by the standards of the regulatory framework that had developed over decades to protect exactly the kinds of interests being raised. Each concern was also, from Musk's perspective, a month lost, a month in which Volkswagen and BMW and Mercedes were not being impeded by comparable processes, though this was partly because they were not, in this period, attempting to build new factories at all. The revealing action of this chapter, the keyhole moment that opens onto the larger character of the man, occurred not in Shanghai or Berlin but in Fremont during a design review for the Model Y's unibody casting, a decision that would come to define Tesla's manufacturing philosophy for the next decade and beyond. Musk had become fixated on a problem that most automotive engineers treated as an immutable constraint. The rear underbody of a modern automobile was assembled from roughly 70 separate stamped metal parts, welded together in a process that required multiple robots, multiple stations, and the kind of cumulative tolerance stack that was the enemy of both precision and speed. The accepted wisdom was that this was simply how cars were made, that the complexity was inherent, that any attempt to reduce it would introduce problems more serious than the ones it solved. Musk wanted to cast the entire rear underbody as a single piece. The idea was not, in its basic engineering logic, absurd. Die casting, forcing molten aluminum into a mold under high pressure to produce a single complex part, was a mature technology used across the automotive industry for smaller components. What Musk was proposing was its application at a scale that nobody had attempted, a single casting roughly the size of a dining table, produced in machines that did not yet exist and would need to be invented for the purpose. When his engineering team raised concerns about the machine sizes required, about the alloy properties at that scale, about the tooling costs and the risk of catastrophic failure modes that wouldn't be understood until production was already underway, Musk's response was characteristically direct. "Find the people who build the biggest die casting machines in the world," he said, "and tell them to build bigger ones." The result was the Giga Press, machines manufactured by the Italian firm IDRA, weighing roughly 400 tons each, capable of generating the clamping force required to produce what Tesla called the megacast. The rear underbody of the Model Y, which had previously required 70-plus parts, and the associated assembly complexity, was replaced by a single casting that reduced part count, reduced weight, reduced the number of potential failure points, and dramatically compressed the assembly process. It was, by almost any measure, one of the most significant manufacturing innovations in the automotive industry in a generation. And it had emerged, as so many of Tesla's manufacturing innovations emerged, from Musk's unwillingness to accept that the existing way of doing something was the only way. The man who helped translate this particular vision into operational reality was Drew Baglino, Tesla's senior vice president of powertrain and energy engineering, who had been with the company since 2006 and had survived, through a combination of genuine brilliance and pragmatic flexibility, the organizational upheavals that had claimed so many of his contemporaries. Baglino occupied a specific and necessary role in the Musk ecosystem, the role of the technically credible lieutenant who could take an idea that existed at the level of first principles and engineer it into something that a factory could actually produce. He was not a yes man, which is why he lasted. He pushed back when the engineering demanded it. He held timelines when Musk's impatience threatened to compress them below the threshold of safety. But he also believed, as the engineer who had watched his child's first steps on a phone screen had believed, in what they were building together. Their relationship during the Gigafactory expansion period was, in the accounts of people who observed it, one of genuine collaborative intensity. Musk providing the conceptual pressure that forced problems to be solved in unconventional ways, Baglino providing the engineering discipline that ensured the solutions didn't create worse problems downstream. It was, in its productive moments, exactly the kind of relationship that Musk needed and rarely managed to sustain, one in which his instincts were both amplified and modulated by someone with the standing to tell him when he was wrong. By the end of 2021, the contours of what Tesla had built were visible in a way they had not been even 3 years earlier. Shanghai was humming. Berlin was approaching, however painfully, the moment of its first vehicle. Austin, Gigafactory Texas, which had been announced in 2020, and broken ground with a speed that would have been impossible in Germany, was rising from the limestone landscape south of the city with the dimensions of something that intended to be permanent. The Model Y had become a global phenomenon. The stock price had made Musk, by the accounting of every major financial publication, the wealthiest private individual in human history. He did not appear, by the accounts of those closest to him, to experience this fact the way most people imagined they would experience it. The number was large enough to have become abstract, a figure that existed in spreadsheets and Bloomberg terminals, and had very little relationship to the actual texture of his daily life, which remained organized around problems, deadlines, and the specific, focused anxiety of a man who believed that everything he had built could still be taken away if he stopped paying attention for long enough. He was paying attention. He was always paying attention. And what he was paying attention to, in the final weeks of 2021, was not the wealth and not the cars, but a communications network spreading across low Earth orbit in a constellation that was growing faster than any satellite system ever launched. A network that had already proven its value in ways that nobody at its inception had fully anticipated, and that was about to become, without anyone quite planning for it, an instrument of geopolitical consequence that would bring Musk into territory where the rules were different, the stakes were higher, and the foam pad on the factory floor would seem in retrospect like the simplest problem he had ever had to solve. Chapter 55. Starlink, launching the global internet constellation. The Falcon 9 stood on the pad at Cape Canaveral, in the particular stillness that precedes a launch, that held breath interval when the machine and the moment seem to achieve a temporary equilibrium before the violence begins. It was May 23, 2019, and inside the nose cone of the rocket, stacked with the precision of a dealer shuffling flat cards, were 60 satellites. Not one. Not the handful that constituted a meaningful deployment in the prior vocabulary of the space industry. 60. Each roughly the size and heft of a cafeteria table, each carrying a phased array antenna and a krypton ion thruster and a piece of software that would allow it, once deployed, to communicate with its neighbors and with the ground with a latency that commercial satellite internet had never achieved. Together, they weighed approximately 13 metric tons, the heaviest payload SpaceX had ever attempted to place in orbit, and they represented, for everyone who understood what they were actually looking at, something more significant than a launch. They represented the opening sentence of a paragraph that, if it was completed, would rewrite the economics of global connectivity from the ground up. Musk was watching from the Launch Control Center, with the expression he wore during SpaceX launches, not the theatrical excitement he performed for cameras at public events, but the compressed inward attention of a man running probability calculations whose inputs only he fully understood. His jaw was set. His hands were still. When the first stage engines ignited, and the Falcon 9 began its ascent, he did not cheer. He watched the trajectory data on the monitor in front of him, and did not speak until the satellite deployment sequence confirmed correctly, at which point he said something brief and quiet to the engineer beside him, and then stood up and walked to a different part of the room, as if proximity to the monitor was something he had only needed for the duration of the uncertainty. 60 satellites. It was a beginning. He needed thousands. To understand Starlink's origin, you have to understand a particular species of frustration that had been accumulating in Musk since at least 2012. The frustration of a man who had spent a decade watching the terrestrial internet infrastructure of the United States fail in the most systematic and predictable ways to reach the approximately 21 million Americans who lived in areas where high-speed broadband was either unavailable or economically inaccessible. The failure was not accidental. It was structural, the product of an industry organized around the economics of density, in which laying fiber or erecting cell towers in rural areas produced returns insufficient to justify the investment. The market had spoken with its customary efficiency, and what it had said was that the people in those areas were too few and too dispersed to be worth the infrastructure. Musk's response to this conclusion was the response he had applied to every conclusion the market had delivered, that he found unacceptable. He proposed to change the infrastructure rather than accept the conclusion. The idea of a low Earth orbit internet constellation was not, in its basic form, original to him. Companies had been attempting versions of it since the 1990s, with results ranging from disappointing to catastrophic. Teledesic, backed in part by Bill Gates and Craig McCaw, had proposed a constellation of 840 satellites in 1994 and collapsed under the weight of its own ambition and cost. Iridium, the satellite phone network that had actually achieved deployment, had filed for bankruptcy in 1999, less than a year after beginning commercial service. The graveyard of failed constellation concepts was well populated, and the tombstones shared a common epitaph: the economics of putting enough satellites in orbit to provide genuinely competitive service using the launch costs and satellite production costs of the 20th century simply did not work. What had changed by the middle of the 2010s was SpaceX. The reusable Falcon 9, by dramatically reducing the cost per kilogram to orbit, had begun to move the economic parameters of the constellation concept from the territory of the impossible toward the territory of the difficult. And the miniaturization of electronics had allowed a satellite that previously would have required the mass of a school bus to achieve performance that could now be packed into something small enough to stack 60 of them in a single fairing. The two curves, falling launch costs and falling satellite mass, had crossed somewhere around 2015, and in the space where they crossed, Starlink was born. The world into which Starlink launched its first operational batch in 2019 was one that had, in the preceding 3 years, developed a newly urgent relationship with the question of who controlled the infrastructure of digital communication. The 2016 election had produced a national conversation about the political consequences of platform power, about algorithmic influence, about information asymmetry, about the degree to which the architecture of the Internet had been captured by a handful of companies whose priorities did not necessarily align with the public interest. The pandemic, which arrived 8 months after the first Starlink launch, intensified this conversation by making high-speed Internet access a matter of immediate material consequence for every family with a child doing school remotely or an adult working from home. The connectivity gap, which had previously been an abstraction in policy discussions, became overnight a visible and personal injustice. Starlink was positioned in this environment to mean something beyond its commercial function. Musk framed it with consistency as an equity project, a mechanism for extending to the world's most isolated populations the same access to information and economic opportunity that the connected world had come to take for granted. The framing was not insincere. He had, from the earliest Starlink presentations, spoken about connectivity in the developing world with a specificity that suggested genuine engagement with the problem rather than rhetorical decoration. But the framing also obscured a set of structural realities about what Starlink actually was and what controlling it actually meant, realities that would become impossible to ignore at precisely the moment they became most consequential. The core conflict of the Starlink era was not, in the years between 2019 and 2021, primarily a commercial one. The commercial challenges were real. The constellation needed to reach a minimum viable scale before it could offer the coverage density required for truly competitive service, which meant Musk needed to launch thousands of satellites before the revenue logic of the enterprise fully closed. But they were, by the standards of the obstacles he had previously navigated, tractable. The capital was available. The rockets were flying. The satellites were getting cheaper to build with each successive batch, as the manufacturing process at the Redmond, Washington facility was refined and accelerated. The conflict that would define Starlink's historical significance was a different kind of conflict entirely, one that Musk could not fully see from where he stood in 2019, because it required a future event to make it visible. The conflict was the one implicit in the proposition that a single private individual, accountable to no electorate and no international body, would control a communications infrastructure capable of providing or denying internet access to populations in active conflict zones, in authoritarian states, in the contested spaces where the interests of governments and the interests of citizens most violently diverged. That conflict was coming. In 2019, it was still below the horizon. What was visible, in 2019 and increasingly through 2020 and 2021, was the ambition of the technical execution. The decision that most clearly illuminates Musk's character during the Starlink build, the keyhole through which the larger man is most legible, was not a single dramatic moment but a sustained and deliberate choice about the pace of deployment that ran directly counter to the advice of virtually every regulatory and competitive intelligence expert in his orbit. The standard approach to constellation deployment, as recommended by satellite industry veterans and reflected in the approval processes of the Federal Communications Commission, was iterative and methodical. Launch a small test constellation, evaluate performance, make design changes, iterate. The approvals Starlink had received from the FCC covered a specific number of satellites in specific orbital shells, and the conventional interpretation of that approval was that SpaceX should proceed carefully, demonstrating compliance with each condition before expanding the constellation further. Musk's interpretation was different. He read the approvals as defining the space within which he could move, not a roadmap for how slowly he should move through it. He accelerated the launch cadence to a rate that astonished even SpaceX's own launch teams. In 2020, SpaceX launched more mass to orbit than any other entity in human history, more than all other launch providers globally combined. The Starlink constellation grew from 60 satellites to hundreds, and then to over 1,000 and then beyond. Each launch dropped the inter-satellite distance, increased coverage density, and moved the constellation closer to the threshold at which it could advertise genuinely competitive service to genuinely large markets. The competitors who had planned to challenge Starlink in the LEO internet market, Amazon's Project Kuiper, OneWeb, Telesat Lightspeed, watched this acceleration with the particular dismay of organizations that had built their competitive strategies around a pace of deployment that their own internal processes could sustain. Musk was not competing on that pace. He was moving at the pace his infrastructure allowed, which was faster than anyone else's infrastructure allowed, which meant that by the time the regulatory and engineering processes of his competitors permitted them to launch their first operational satellites, Musk would already have established a coverage density and a customer base that would be extraordinarily difficult to displace. It was the same competitive logic he had applied at Tesla. Use vertical integration and manufacturing speed to achieve a scale advantage before incumbents could respond, translated into orbital mechanics. The man most responsible for translating this strategic logic into actual satellites in actual orbit was Gwynne Shotwell, whose role in the Starlink story was both more central and more complicated than her public profile suggested. Shotwell had been the operational spine of SpaceX since 2002, the person who ran the company in the sense that running means managing the human, financial, and regulatory complexity that allows a visionary to keep his attention on the vision. Her relationship with Musk was, by the time of the Starlink launches, nearly 2 decades old, a partnership that had survived the 3 consecutive launch failures of the early Falcon 1 era, the near bankruptcy of 2008, the rapid scaling of the Falcon 9, and the production demands of the Crew Dragon program. What made the Starlink period distinctive in the context of their relationship was the degree to which it asked Shotwell to operate at a scale and in a regulatory environment that was qualitatively different from anything SpaceX had previously managed. Launching cargo to the International Space Station required managing a bilateral relationship with NASA, an organization Shotwell understood deeply and had spent years cultivating. Deploying a global internet constellation required managing relationships with telecommunications regulators in dozens of countries, spectrum coordination bodies, astronomical institutions concerned about the effect of satellite trains on observational science, and national governments whose definition of acceptable satellite operations varied considerably from Musk's own. Shotwell managed these relationships with a diplomatic fluency that Musk neither possessed nor, in most cases, attempted to perform. She was the one who sat in the rooms where the language of compromise was spoken, who found formulations that satisfied regulators without constraining the technical ambitions of the program, who maintained the institutional credibility that Musk's public behavior periodically threatened to erode. In the accounts of people who dealt with SpaceX during the Starlink build, she was the reason the program remained operational during the moments when Musk's public provocations, his Twitter behavior, his media appearances, his casual contempt for regulatory conventions, might otherwise have produced consequences more serious than they did. Their relationship, during this period, was the functional partnership of people who have each developed a precise understanding of what the other is and is not capable of, and who have organized their collaboration around that understanding without needing to discuss it. Musk provided the vision, the pressure, and the willingness to move faster than the environment suggested was safe. Shotwell provided the organizational competence, the diplomatic temperament, and the institutional memory that kept the enterprise navigable. Neither function, in isolation, would have been sufficient. Together, they constituted a management system that was stranger and more effective than any business school had a framework to describe. By the end of 2021, Starlink had approximately 145,000 active subscribers in 14 countries, was generating early but meaningful revenue, and was producing data about network performance that validated the core technical proposition that had animated the project from the beginning. The latency was competitive with terrestrial broadband. The speeds, for subscribers in rural areas who had previously been managing on satellite connections with 400 millisecond delays, were transformative in the most literal sense. They changed the texture of daily life in ways that translated directly into economic and educational opportunity. The beta program testimonials that circulated on social media during this period had a quality that Tesla's early reviews had shared, a quality of genuine astonishment, the specific register of people who had been told for years that their connectivity situation was simply the way things were, discovering that it was not, in fact, the way things had to be. A sheep farmer in rural Montana, a teacher in a village in Mozambique, a family in the Australian outback whose children were doing their schoolwork on satellite connections that could buffer for minutes at a time. These were the human faces of the mission that Musk had been describing since the first Starlink presentations, and their experiences were exactly what he had said they would be. What he had not said, and perhaps not fully considered, was what it would mean when those same connections, that infrastructure he had built and owned and controlled, became the only communication link available to a population not in Montana or Mozambique, but in a war zone, in a country fighting for its survival, asking him to decide in real time whether their soldiers could use his network to kill people. That question was not yet on his desk in December 2021. But the infrastructure that would make it unavoidable was already in orbit, circling the planet every 90 minutes. And somewhere in Kyiv, in the defense ministry of a country whose name Musk could not yet have told you was about to change the world, officials were watching the constellation grow and beginning to understand with a clarity that preceded the crisis by just enough time to be useful, that this private American satellites might be the difference between defeat and survival. Chapter 56. Crew Dragon, returning astronauts to the ISS. The suit was white with black trim, and it fit the way no spacesuit in the history of American human spaceflight had ever fit, like something a person might actually want to wear. That was not an accident. Musk had insisted on the suit with the same granular attention he brought to the interior of a Tesla, the same conviction that the aesthetic experience of a thing was not separable from its functional identity, but was in fact a form of argument. The puffy orange pressure suits that NASA astronauts had worn since the shuttle era, practical, thoroughly engineered, visually reminiscent of something a deep-sea salvage diver might reluctantly pull on, communicated in their design language that space travel was industrial, unglamorous, a matter of survival equipment rather than aspiration. Musk wanted the suit to communicate something different. He wanted it to say that this was the future, and the future was worth looking at. Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley climbed into Crew Dragon on the morning of May 30, 2020, wearing those suits, and the image that was transmitted from the launch pad at Kennedy Space Center, two astronauts, lean and composed in a capsule whose interior looked less like a Cold War pressure vessel and more like a product that Apple might have designed if Apple had decided one day to build a spacecraft, traveled around the world with a speed and penetration that no NASA launch had achieved in a generation. People who did not follow the space industry watched. People who had been children during Apollo, and had spent the intervening decades quietly grieving the retreat from that ambition watched. People who had spent the 9 years since the final space shuttle flight watching American astronauts board Russian Soyuz vehicles at Baikonur Cosmodrome, paying tens of millions of dollars per seat to a country that had become a geopolitical adversary, watched with the specific emotion of people who had been waiting for something without quite knowing they were waiting. Musk watched from the Launch Control Center with his hands clasped, leaning forward in the posture of a man who has done everything he can do and is now entirely at the mercy of physics and probability. He had cried at rocket launches before, openly without apparent embarrassment, the emotion arriving faster than the composure that might have contained it. In the moments before ignition on May 30th, the people beside him could see that he was working to hold himself together, and not entirely succeeding. He had been working toward this moment for 18 years. To understand what the Crew Dragon launch meant in the context of 2020, you have to hold simultaneously in mind two realities that the American public was in that season almost entirely incapable of holding simultaneously: the sublime and the catastrophic. The United States in May of 2020 was a country in acute crisis in a way that made the word crisis feel inadequate. The pandemic had by the end of May killed nearly 100,000 Americans, a figure that had seemed in January like a worst-case projection too extreme to take seriously, and that was by May simply the number. The economy had contracted with a speed and severity that exceeded the initial months of the Great Depression. And 8 days before the Crew Dragon launch, a Minneapolis police officer had murdered George Floyd on a street corner, and the country had ignited. Musk had navigated the early pandemic period with a combativeness that had cost him, in the short term, a significant portion of the goodwill he had accumulated through the Tesla and SpaceX achievements. He had dismissed the severity of the virus on Twitter with a confidence that the epidemiological data did not support, had publicly resisted the closure of the Fremont factory in defiance of county health orders, and had made a series of statements that revealed, if nothing else, the specific blindness of a man who had spent so long solving problems through sheer force of will that he had developed an instinctive skepticism toward problems that force of will could not solve. But the launch existed in a different register from the culture war that had surrounded his pandemic behavior. On the day of the launch, the country needed, with the particular desperation of people who have been living inside a long emergency, something that pointed upward rather than downward. The Crew Dragon provided it, not as propaganda, not as distraction, but as a genuine achievement that connected, however tenuously, to the best version of what American technological ambition could produce. President Trump attended the launch, as did Vice President Pence, in an acknowledgement that the event transcended the political categories that had organized everything else. Jim Bridenstine, the NASA administrator, stood beside Musk and spoke with the unguarded enthusiasm of a man who did not feel the need to calibrate his emotion for an audience. The core conflict of this chapter was one that had been developing for the entire arc of SpaceX's existence, but had concentrated, in the years between the commercial crew selection and the launch itself, into its sharpest form. It was the conflict between institutional credibility and entrepreneurial speed, between the culture of NASA, which had been shaped by the trauma of Challenger and Columbia, into an organization where the primary value was the systematic elimination of risk, and the culture of SpaceX, which had been shaped by Musk, into an organization where the primary value was the systematic compression of the timeline to the acceptable level of risk. These were not, in theory, incompatible cultures. In practice, they had produced, across the decade of the commercial crew program, a relationship of such sustained tension that people who participated in it described the experience in terms that alternated between admiration and exhaustion. NASA's safety review processes, the human rating requirements, the certification milestones, the design reference mission standards that governed every aspect of a crewed spacecraft, were not bureaucratic obstacles in any trivial sense. They were the accumulated institutional response to the deaths of 17 astronauts across 2 shuttle disasters, and the people who enforced them did so with the conviction of custodians protecting something that could not be recovered if it was lost. Musk's response to these processes was not contempt. He was too intelligent for contempt, and the deaths of the Challenger and Columbia crews were not abstractions to him. It was something more like impatience, modulated by the minimum level of respect that the stakes demanded. He believed, and said repeatedly, that the perfect could be the enemy of the good, that the endless refinement of a safety case could delay a program until the program had no political survival, and that the only way to prove that a crewed spacecraft was safe was, ultimately, to fly it with people. The reviews were necessary. They were also, in his view, consistently more extensive than the actual risk profile of the vehicle required. The Crew Dragon's development history contained at least 2 moments where this tension between the cultures nearly broke the program entirely. In April of 2019, during a ground test of the launch abort system, a hypergolic propellant leak caused an explosion that destroyed the capsule being tested and sent a debris field across the Cape Canaveral test site. Nobody was killed because nobody was in the capsule, but the explosion was violent enough and visible enough, and occurred in enough proximity to what would have been an occupied vehicle that it required months of engineering investigation, design modification, and renewed certification work before the program could proceed. It was, in the language of the aerospace industry, an anomaly. In the language of the human beings who had been following the program, it was the specific nightmare scenario that NASA's safety culture existed to prevent from recurring during an actual crewed mission. Musk absorbed the explosion with the compressed stoicism he brought to SpaceX failures, the rapid transition from the initial impact of bad news to the forward-facing posture of problem identification. He appeared in front of employees after the anomaly with the directness that the SpaceX workforce had come to expect. No minimization, no blame shifting, no corporate euphemism. There was a problem. They would find it. They would fix it. They would fly. The sequence was not a performance. It was simply the way his mind organized the world, in which setbacks were inputs to be processed rather than wounds to be mourned. The specific decision that most reveals his character during the Crew Dragon development came not during a crisis, but during a design review, several years before the May 2020 launch, in which the question of the capsule's interior human interface was under discussion. NASA had accumulated across decades of human spaceflight a detailed and extensively validated set of standards for cockpit design, the placement of controls, the logic of displays, the cognitive mapping between the physical interface and the operational information the crew needed to manage. The standards were conservative by design. They had been developed to be operable by astronauts under stress, under G-loading in emergencies, by people whose capacity for sophisticated interface navigation would be constrained by exactly the conditions in which the interface most needed to work. SpaceX's proposed interface, a touchscreen system of considerable elegance and software sophistication, met significant resistance from NASA human factors engineers who argued that touchscreens under vibration and G-load introduced failure modes that physical switches and hard controls did not. The argument was not unreasonable. Touchscreens require fine motor control that high vibration environments degrade. A physical switch, once positioned, stays positioned. A touchscreen that has been inadvertently touched in a high G environment where the crew's hands are under load may not. Musk's response was to engage with the specific technical objection rather than dismiss it, to ask for the data on touchscreen performance under the relevant vibration spectra, to commission testing, and to design a hybrid system that retained physical backup controls for critical functions while preserving the touchscreen interface that was, in his judgment, and ultimately in the judgment of the NASA certification team, acceptable for the operational envelope of the mission. What the exchange revealed was not stubbornness exactly, but a specific intellectual pattern. He would resist a requirement that rested on institutional convention rather than specific engineering data, but he would not resist data. The distinction mattered. It was what separated him, on his better days, from someone who was simply obstinate. The relationship that defined the Crew Dragon era, and that illuminated both the strengths and the structural fragility of SpaceX's human spaceflight program, was the one between Musk and Bill Gerstenmaier, the NASA Associate Administrator for Human Exploration and Operations who had overseen NASA's human spaceflight programs since 2005. Gerstenmaier, known universally within the space community as Gerst, was, by any serious assessment, one of the most accomplished human spaceflight program managers in the history of the discipline. He had managed the International Space Station program through its construction phase, had shepherded the Commercial Crew program from its inception, and possessed a depth of institutional knowledge about the operational requirements of crewed spaceflight that was without parallel in the American aerospace community. His relationship with Musk was, by the accounts of people who observed it across the decade of the Commercial Crew Program, one of sustained mutual respect, operating across a sustained fundamental disagreement about pace. Gerstenmaier believed that the Commercial Crew Program was moving as fast as the actual safety requirements of crewed spaceflight permitted. Musk believed it was moving as fast as NASA's institutional culture permitted, which was not the same thing. Both beliefs were defensible. The productive tension between them produced, ultimately, a spacecraft that satisfied NASA's human rating requirements, while achieving certification on a timeline that would have been impossible if either man's instincts had gone entirely unchecked. Gerstenmaier was, in the summer of 2019, removed from his role as associate administrator by Jim Bridenstine in a reorganization that was widely interpreted within the space community as a response to schedule delays in the Commercial Crew Program. His departure removed from the NASA-SpaceX relationship the institutional counterweight that had, through a decade of friction, helped ensure that the pace of Crew Dragon's development was calibrated against something more than Musk's impatience. The people who noted this at the time did so quietly, and then watched the launch on May 30th with the rest of the country, and felt, in the moment of Crew Dragon's successful docking with the International Space Station, the complex satisfaction of people who had been right about the destination and uncertain all along about the route. When Benken and Hurley floated through the hatch into the ISS, and turned back to the camera with the expressions of men who were trying, and not entirely managing, to look professionally composed about something that was making them feel things a professional composure was not designed to contain, Musk was in the SpaceX Mission Control Center in Hawthorne. He had his fist pressed against his mouth. His eyes were bright. Around him, engineers who had spent years of their lives building the thing that had just worked were embracing each other with the abandon of people who had been holding tension for so long that its release was physically overwhelming. He said afterward that it was the greatest day of his professional life. He said this without the hedging and qualification he typically applied to superlatives, said it with the directness of someone stating a fact that required no elaboration. For a man who had sent the first private rocket to orbit, who had built the world's most valuable automobile company from the ground up, who had deployed the largest satellite constellation in human history, the statement carried weight. What it also carried, though neither Musk nor anyone in that room was thinking about it in the specific terms that the next 18 months would make unavoidable, was the implicit responsibility that came with having demonstrated, beyond any reasonable dispute, that a private company could do what only governments had previously done, that the infrastructure of human spaceflight, the most consequential and technically demanding infrastructure human beings had ever built, was now, in some meaningful sense, his. The astronauts floating in the ISS had arrived in his vehicle, on his rocket, and would return to Earth in his capsule. The dependency was mutual, for now. But dependencies, in Musk's history, had a way of resolving in one direction, and the direction was never away from him. High above the planet, in the orbital shell where the Starlink constellation was thickening with each successive launch, the satellites continued their silent, methodical work. And in the corridors of the Pentagon and in the intelligence agencies of America's adversaries, analysts who had spent careers studying the intersection of private capability and national security were writing memos that had not yet reached the desks of the people who needed to read them, about what it would mean when the infrastructure of the next war ran through the servers of a man who answered to no one. Chapter 57. The Raptor Engine Crisis. The email arrived on a Sunday. It was late November 2021, and the SpaceX employees who received it were, in many cases, at home with their families in the particular suspended quality of a holiday weekend. The compressed domesticity of people who had traded the ordinary rhythms of civilian life for the extraordinary demands of a company that treated the boundary between work time and personal time as a suggestion rather than a contract. Some were eating. Some were watching football. Some were sleeping in the specific way that people sleep when they have been running at 90% capacity for so long that any reduction in the operational tempo produces almost immediately a kind of gravitational collapse. The email from Musk did not allow the collapse to continue. It ran to several paragraphs, and it was written in the register that Musk reserved for communications that he needed people to understand were not rhetorical, not the performative urgency of a leader manufacturing crisis to motivate a workforce, but the functional urgency of a man who had looked at the numbers and concluded that the numbers did not lie. The Raptor engine production rate, he wrote, had become a genuine risk of bankruptcy for SpaceX. The engine that was supposed to power Starship, the most ambitious rocket in the history of human spaceflight, the vehicle on which Musk had staked not merely his fortune, but his foundational proposition about the future of the species, was not being manufactured fast enough. Not close to fast enough. And if the rate did not change, and change quickly, the company that had just successfully put astronauts in orbit might not survive to put humans on Mars. He had their attention. To understand the specific character of the Raptor crisis, you have to understand what the Raptor engine actually was, what it represented in the context of the history of rocket propulsion, and why building it at scale had proven so dramatically more difficult than the audacity of its conception had suggested. The Raptor was a full-flow staged combustion engine running on liquid methane and liquid oxygen. This combination of propellants and combustion cycle had been discussed in aerospace engineering literature since the 1960s as theoretically optimal, capable of achieving specific impulse figures that liquid, kerosene engines like the Falcon 9's Merlin could not approach, but had never been brought to operational flight by any space agency or private company in the world. The Soviet Union had come closest with the Road 270 program in the 1960s, and had abandoned the effort after the engineering complexity proved intractable under the technological constraints of the era. The difficulty was not mysterious. Full-flow staged combustion required operating turbopumps at pressures and temperatures that pushed the material science of the mid-20th century to its absolute boundary, and in many cases past it. By 2021, the material science had improved. But the engineering difficulty had not become trivial. It had merely become possible, which is a different thing. Building a Raptor engine required manufacturing components to tolerances that were, in the parlance of the engineers working on them, at the edge of what the available machining technology could reliably achieve. A Merlin engine, by contrast, was, in the relative terms of rocket engineering, mature, understood, producible, at a rate that the Hawthorne factory had turned into a genuine industrial process. SpaceX had built hundreds of Merlins. It had the institutional knowledge of a company that had made its mistakes, internalized their lessons, and developed manufacturing processes that could produce a reliable engine with the systematized confidence of a company that knew what it was doing. With Raptor, SpaceX was, in the autumn of 2021, still in the phase that precedes that confidence. It was the phase of unexpected failures and unforeseen interactions and material behaviors that the models had not predicted, and that could only be discovered by building engines and running them until they failed, and understanding from the failure mode what the models had missed. This was not a sign of incompetence. It was the inevitable character of developing a genuinely novel technology at a rate that compressed the normal decade of incremental learning into years. The contextual world of late 2021 amplified the specific anxieties that the Raptor crisis generated. SpaceX was, by the assessments of the financial analysts who tracked the private space industry, one of the most valuable private companies in the United States, worth, by various estimates, somewhere between $80 and $100 billion. The Starlink constellation was generating early revenue. The Falcon 9 was flying commercial and government payloads at a rate that no other launch vehicle in the world could approach. And the Crew Dragon had transformed SpaceX's relationship with NASA from contractor to essential partner. On paper, SpaceX was a triumph. But paper and reality in the world of building rockets have a way of diverging at the moments when divergence is most expensive. The NASA Artemis program, the lunar return effort that had selected SpaceX's Starship as the human landing system, a contract worth billions and dependent entirely on Starship actually existing in a flyable configuration, was under schedule pressure of its own. Blue Origin, Jeff Bezos' space company, had challenged the HLS contract award in a protest that had tied the program in legal proceedings for months before being dismissed. The resolution of that protest cleared the legal path for Starship's development, but did not clear the engineering path, and the engineering path ran directly through the Raptor production rate. Meanwhile, the competitive landscape of the space industry was shifting in ways that created a specific and time-sensitive pressure on SpaceX's ability to demonstrate Starship's viability. The United Launch Alliance, which had spent decades as the dominant provider of national security launch services, was transitioning its own launch infrastructure in ways that created both opportunity and urgency for SpaceX's positioning. The Department of Defense was making launch contract decisions that would define the architecture of American military space capability for the next decade. Every week that Starship's development slipped was a week in which competitors, underfunded, technologically behind but real, had time to close gaps that Musk needed to remain gaps. The core conflict of the Raptor crisis was, at its deepest level, the same conflict that had defined every critical moment in SpaceX's history, rendered in a new and more technically demanding register: the conflict between the pace that the mission required and the pace that the engineering reality permitted. Musk had always lived in the former. The Raptor engine lived, stubbornly and expensively, in the latter. The specific obstacle was not a single component or a single failure mode, but a systemic manufacturing challenge that cascaded across multiple subsystems simultaneously. The turbopumps were failing at rates that exceeded the predictions of the design models. The combustion chamber walls, operating at the extreme pressures that the full-flow staged combustion cycle required, were exhibiting thermal behavior that the material properties data had not fully captured. The production process for the engine's injector, the component that mixed the propellants before combustion in a pattern precise enough to achieve stable burning at extreme chamber pressure, was yielding acceptable parts at rates that made scaling production mathematically difficult. Each problem was solvable, in the sense that SpaceX's engineers were solving them one by one, with the iterative methodism of people who had been trained to regard failure as data. But solving them simultaneously, at the pace required to support the Starship flight test timeline, while also maintaining the Falcon 9 production rate that funded the entire enterprise, was straining the organization in ways that were beginning to show. The revealing action of this period, the moment that most clearly illuminates the specific character of Musk's leadership under existential pressure, was not the email itself but what preceded it. In the weeks before the email was sent, Musk had been present at the Raptor production facility with a frequency and a granularity of attention that his engineers described as both galvanizing and destabilizing. He had personally reviewed production data, interrogated failure analysis reports, stood in front of engines that had failed on the test stand, and asked questions that moved with the speed of his processing, from the specific failure mode to the manufacturing process that had produced the failed component to the organizational structure that had made that manufacturing process seem acceptable. He had identified, through this process, what he believed was the fundamental problem. The Raptor production operation had been organized, at the management level, around a set of assumptions about the difficulty of the manufacturing challenge that the actual difficulty of the manufacturing challenge had rendered obsolete. The assumptions had been reasonable when they were made. They were no longer reasonable. And the people responsible for those assumptions, the production managers who had built their schedules and their staffing models and their quality control processes around them, had not updated their models at the pace that the evidence demanded. Musk fired them. Not all of them, but enough of them, and with sufficient abruptness that the organizational message was unmistakable. The production rate was not a negotiable variable. It was the variable on which everything else depended, and anyone whose mental model of the achievable rate had not kept pace with the actual requirements of the mission was, regardless of their individual competence and their personal loyalty and the years they had given to the company, not the right person for the moment the company was in. The firings were, in the assessment of people who observed them from various distances, simultaneously defensible and costly. Defensible because the production situation was genuinely critical, and because the organizational inertia that the departures were intended to break was real. Costly because the institutional knowledge that walked out with the fired managers was real too, and because the signal the firings sent to the remaining workforce, that the criteria for job security were not performance against the previous standard but performance against the new and higher standard Musk was now imposing, produced in some portion of the team the motivated clarity he intended, and in another portion the corrosive anxiety that is the enemy of the focused creative problem solving that a manufacturing crisis most requires. The person who navigated this period with the most visible difficulty, and whose trajectory through it most clearly illuminated the human cost of Musk's management style at its most unmodulated, was Mark Juncosa, SpaceX's vice president of vehicle engineering, who had been one of the central figures in Starship's technical development, and whose relationship with Musk combined genuine mutual respect with the specific tension of a technically brilliant subordinate who had learned through repeated experience that the distance between Musk's vision and the engineering reality was a gap that he, Juncosa, was expected to close by any means necessary, and on any timeline, Musk declared. Juncosa was not among those fired. He was, if anything, among those on whom the burden of the crisis was concentrated. The person in the organizational structure who absorbed both Musk's demands from above and the engineering constraints from below, and was required in real time to translate between them. His relationship with Musk during this period was the relationship of a man being asked to perform a function that required him to be two things simultaneously: a faithful executor of a vision whose pace he could not always endorse, and an honest advocate for engineering realities that his principal did not always want to hear. He managed it, because managing it was what the mission required, and because, like Shotwell, like Baglino, like the small number of people in Musk's orbit who survived the long haul, he had found the specific accommodation between his own judgment and Musk's authority that allowed him to remain functional inside a system that many others found incompatible with sustained operation. The email's most important word was genuine. Musk had used urgency before, had declared crises, demanded accelerations, imposed deadlines that the people receiving them understood to be aspirational rather than literal. The workforce had developed, across years of this, a calibrated skepticism about the gradient of actual alarm contained in any given Musk pronouncement. Genuine risk of bankruptcy was, in this context, a phrase calibrated to defeat that skepticism, to communicate that this particular alarm existed at a different level than the operational pressure that had become the background noise of working at SpaceX, that the financial mathematics underlying it were real, and that the people reading it needed to respond not with their usual competent professionalism, but with something closer to the focused desperation of people who understand that the institution they have given their working lives to is capable, under the right conditions, of ceasing to exist. The workforce responded. The production rate began to improve. The organizational restructuring that the firings had enabled, abrupt, painful, and in several cases arguably unjust to the individuals it affected, created the operational space for a new management layer to approach the Raptor manufacturing challenge with the fresh eyes and the recalibrated assumptions that Musk believed the situation demanded. The progress was not immediate, and it was not linear, but by the early months of 2022 it was visible in the data, and visible data was, in Musk's epistemology, the only currency that mattered. Starship stood on its launch mount at Boca Chica, Texas, a structure of stainless steel rising to a height that made the Falcon 9, standing beside it in any photograph, look like a child's toy, and awaited the engines that would determine whether the most ambitious rocket in the history of human spaceflight would fly or would become the most expensive monument to overreach that the space industry had ever produced. The engineers working the Raptor production line, in the converted facilities in McGregor, Texas, understood that the answer to that question would be produced in some meaningful sense by their hands. And in Washington, in the offices of the Federal Aviation Administration, a review process that would determine whether Starship was permitted to fly at all was moving forward with the methodical deliberation of a regulatory body that had not yet encountered, in the full force of its institutional attention, a man who believed that the timeline of the possible was whatever he decided it was. Chapter 58. Neuralink, the brain-computer interface vision. The pig's name was Gertrude. She was unremarkable in every visible way. A healthy, ordinarily proportioned animal, moving around her pen with the incurious contentment of a creature whose concerns did not extend much beyond the immediate sensory field. She rooted at the substrate. She shifted her weight. She breathed. And on the monitor beside her enclosure, a cascade of neural signals translated her snout's every exploratory contact with the world into a real-time graph of electrical activity, spikes and valleys rendered in crisp digital clarity, the intimate electrophysiology of a living brain made legible to anyone in the room who cared to look. Elon Musk stood beside that enclosure in August of 2020 and described what the audience was seeing with the particular quality of enthusiasm he brought to demonstrations that he believed were being misunderstood by almost everyone who had not yet seen them. He was not performing excitement. He was attempting, with the urgency of a man who had been thinking about a problem for years and had concluded that the thinking needed to stop and the building needed to start, to transfer to the people watching. Scientists, journalists, potential recruits, the curious and the skeptical, the specific conviction that what they were witnessing was not a novelty but a beginning. "It's like a Fitbit in your skull," he said with the reductive casualness that was his preferred rhetorical mode for things he considered transformative, with tiny wires. Gertrude moved. The monitor spiked. The room was quiet, in the way rooms go quiet, when the thing being demonstrated is real enough to produce in the people watching a cognitive recalibration that takes a moment to complete. Neuralink had been founded in 2016, in the particular interstice between Musk's existing commitments that represented, to anyone observing his schedule, something that was already beyond the manageable, between the production hell that was approaching at Tesla and the constellation deployment that was being assembled at SpaceX, and the dozen other organizational demands on a man who routinely described sleep as a concession to biology rather than a restorative practice he valued. That he had found the bandwidth to conceive, fund, staff, and begin operational work on a company whose ambition was to develop a surgically implanted device capable of reading and writing neural signals at bandwidth sufficient to constitute a genuine interface between a human brain and a digital system, was, by the standards of normal human cognitive capacity, not quite believable. By the standards of Musk's cognitive capacity, it was simply the next problem on the list. To understand why this particular problem occupied the position it did on that list, you have to understand the specific architecture of the fear that had organized Musk's thinking about artificial intelligence since at least 2014. The fear that had driven him to co-found OpenAI, that had shaped his public warnings about AI safety, and that had produced, in the private conversations of the people who knew him best, a portrait of a man who was not performing concern about machine intelligence but was genuinely, viscerally convinced that the trajectory of AI development, if left unaddressed, pointed toward outcomes that would be catastrophic for the human species. The fear was not, in its specific character, the science fiction fear of robot uprising, the Terminator narrative that made for satisfying cinema and bad policy. It was more subtle, and in the judgment of the AI safety researchers who had been working the problem for decades before Musk discovered it, more sophisticated. It was the fear of misalignment. The fear that an artificial intelligence system sufficiently capable to be genuinely transformative would, by the nature of the optimization processes that produced it, develop objectives that were not aligned with human values, and that a system with misaligned objectives and superhuman capability would, essentially by definition, be an existential problem that no amount of human intelligence could solve after the fact. Musk's proposed solution to this problem, his characteristically direct and characteristically radical response to a challenge that most people in the AI field were addressing through incremental technical research, was to change the terms of the competition. If AI was going to become smarter than humans, then humans needed to become smarter too. The path to human intelligence enhancement, as he had come to understand it, ran through the interface between biology and silicon, through the development of a high-bandwidth, bidirectional connection between the neural substrate of human cognition and the computational infrastructure that was rapidly outpacing it. Neuralink was not, in this framing, a medical device company, though it would need to operate as one to achieve regulatory approval and clinical deployment. It was a species preservation project, dressed in the clothes of neurotechnology. The world into which Neuralink's first major public demonstration arrived in 2020 was one that had developed, across the preceding 5 years, a newly complicated relationship with the intersection of technology and the human body. CRISPR gene editing had moved from laboratory curiosity to clinical application with a speed that had outpaced the bioethical frameworks designed to evaluate it. COVID vaccines were, in the very month of Gertrude's public debut, moving through emergency authorization processes that had compressed the normal timeline of clinical evaluation in ways that were simultaneously miraculous and, for a significant portion of the population, anxiety-producing. The question of what it meant to modify the human body with engineered technology was no longer a philosophical abstraction. It was a live political and ethical controversy, conducted in the same information environment that had made every other controversy louder and less tractable. Into this environment, Musk introduced the proposition that brain surgery to implant a coin-sized device with electrodes threading into neural tissue was a reasonable step for healthy humans to take in order to remain competitive with artificial intelligence. The reaction was predictable in its range, if not in its intensity. Neuroscientists, who had spent careers working on brain-computer interfaces, a field with a 30-year history of genuine incremental progress that had produced real clinical benefits for patients with paralysis and neurological disease, found themselves in the uncomfortable position of welcoming the funding and attention that Musk brought to their field, while wincing at the gap between the clinical reality of neural interfaces and the civilizational ambitions he was describing. The ethicists were more straightforwardly alarmed. The public, characteristically, was divided along the lines that divided the public on everything Musk did, into those who believed he was the only person in the world serious enough to address the problems he was describing, and those who believed he was the most dangerous kind of visionary, one with the resources to act on visions that had not been adequately examined. The core conflict of Neuralink's early years was not the ethical debate that surrounded it in the public discourse. Musk engaged with ethical objections to his projects the way he engaged with most objections, by noting them, finding them insufficiently grounded in engineering specifics to be operationally relevant, and proceeding. The conflict that actually defined the company's internal life, and that most directly shaped its trajectory through the years between founding and the pig demonstration, was the conflict between the neuroscience and the engineering, between the biological reality of what the brain would permit and the technological ambition of what Musk wanted to achieve. The brain is not a passive substrate. It is a living tissue that responds to foreign objects with an immune response, a process of inflammation and cellular reaction that, in the context of an implanted electrode array, produces a degradation of signal quality over time as glial cells encapsulate the electrodes and the tissue interface changes. This was not a new discovery. It had been the central challenge of implanted neural interfaces for decades, and the entire field had organized much of its research energy around the question of how to design electrodes and surface coatings that would minimize the biological response and extend the functional lifetime of an implant. Musk's response to this challenge was the same response he had applied to every engineering challenge that the existing literature considered difficult. He hired the best people in the field and told them to solve it faster than the field believed was possible. The recruitment operation at Neuralink in its first years was, by the accounts of the neuroscientists and engineers who participated in it, extraordinary in its ambition and in several cases in its ruthlessness. Musk reached into academic departments and existing medical device companies and pulled out people whose work he had identified as representing the highest current capability in their respective specialties. The compensation was significant. The mission pitch was for the researchers who found it credible, unlike anything they had been offered in an academic or clinical context. The proposition that the work they had been doing incrementally in institutions organized around grant cycles and publication timelines could be done faster and at greater scale with the resources of a well-funded startup, and the operational tempo of a company whose founder did not accept that the current pace of progress was the only possible pace. The revealing action of the Neuralink story, the moment that most clearly opens onto the character of the man behind it, was not a technical decision but a naming one, and it occurred in the earliest organizational discussions about what the company was actually trying to build. Musk had come to those discussions with a prepared framework that he called, in the internal shorthand that became company vocabulary, the neural lace, a concept he had encountered in the science fiction of Ian M. Banks, in which a network of implanted computing elements integrated with neural tissue to produce a seamless interface between biological and digital cognition. The concept was, from a neuroscience standpoint, science fiction. The tissue integration required, the electrode density needed, the signal processing capability demanded. All of it existed at a remove from current technology that the neuroscientists in the room estimated in decades, not years. Musk listened to these estimates with the expression, patient, attentive, and fundamentally unpersuaded, of a man who had heard comparable estimates about the timeline for reusable rockets and electric vehicles and satellite internet constellations, and who had found, in each case, that the estimates were conservative in the specific way that experts' estimates are conservative when they are predicting the rate of progress within the existing paradigm rather than the rate of progress that becomes available when you change the paradigm. He did not dismiss the neuroscientists. He hired them, funded them, and then told them that their job was to figure out how to make the science fiction real, not to explain why it wasn't real yet. This was the quality that made Neuralink genuinely different from the neurotechnology companies that had preceded it, and that made its potential both more significant and more unsettling than a straightforward medical device narrative would suggest. Musk was not building a better electrode array for patients with ALS, though he was building that too, and though the clinical value of that application was real and uncontroversial. He was building towards something that had no clinical category, a healthy human enhancement technology that would require a regulatory framework that did not yet exist, an ethical consensus that had not yet been achieved, and a public appetite for elective brain surgery that had not yet been demonstrated. The person who carried the weight of translating this ambition into something that could actually be evaluated by the FDA was Max Hodak, Neuralink's president in its early years, whose relationship with Musk had the texture of most important relationships in Musk's organizational life, a combination of genuine intellectual partnership and the sustained friction of a person who was close enough to the vision to share its excitement and close enough to the operational reality to understand at a level of specificity that Musk sometimes resisted what the vision would actually cost. Hodak was, in the accounts of people who worked with both men, one of the few people in the Neuralink organization capable of engaging Musk's technical intuitions on their own terms, of pushing back not with the bureaucratic resistance of someone defending institutional convention, but with the engineering specificity of someone who had done the calculation and found a different answer. Their collaboration produced Neuralink's first-generation implant system, the N1 chip, and its associated robotic surgical platform, a device designed to insert electrode threads of such fineness that they could be placed in neural tissue with minimal vascular disruption by a robot capable of operating at the spatial resolution that the human hand could not achieve. The surgical robot was, in itself, an engineering achievement of considerable elegance, a machine that moved with the precision of something that had been designed from first principles for a task that no existing surgical robot had been designed to perform. Hodak departed Neuralink in 2021, in the quiet way that key figures in Musk's organizations often departed, without public acrimony, with statements of mutual respect that the people making them clearly intended to be taken at face value, and with the unmistakable suggestion for those reading between the lines that the specific accommodation between individual judgment and Musk's operational demands had reached a limit. His departure left the company in a different configuration, more directly organized around Musk's own priorities, less modulated by a counterweight of comparable technical standing. Gertrude, for her part, had no opinion about any of this. She continued to root and shift and breathe in her enclosure, her neural signals continuing their uninstructed broadcast, indifferent to the cameras and the observers and the weight of meaning that the humans in the room had placed on her ordinary pig cognition. She was, as Musk had said, simply a healthy pig with a chip in her brain. The simplicity of that description was doing a great deal of work, and the work it was doing was to make something that would have seemed a decade earlier, like the premise of a dystopian novel, feel, in August of 2020, like the first tentative paragraph of a future that was already being written, with or without the consent of the people who would eventually be asked to live in it. In the corridors of the FDA's Center for Devices and Radiological Health, where the regulatory framework for the first human implants was being assembled with the institutional deliberation of an agency whose entire organizational culture was organized around the prevention of the specific category of harm that ambitious medical technology companies historically produced when they moved faster than the evidence supported. Officials were reading the Neuralink presentations and writing memos to each other about the gap between what was being claimed and what had been demonstrated. And none of those memos contained language suggesting that the gap was going to close as quickly as the man in Hawthorne, California, who was simultaneously running a car company, a rocket company, a satellite network, and was about to acquire the world's most consequential social media platform, clearly believed it would. Chapter 59. The Boring Company, the Las Vegas Loop. The tunnel smelled like fresh concrete and ambition, which are, in the end, not entirely different things. It was June of 2021, and the first passengers to ride the Las Vegas Convention Center loop were doing so in Tesla Model X SUVs driven by human drivers, a detail that the promotional materials for the project did not emphasize, given that the original conception of the Boring Company's tunnels had featured autonomous electric pods gliding passengers through underground tubes at speeds approaching 150 miles per hour, guided by software requiring no human intervention, representing a fundamental reimagining of what urban transit could be. What the first passengers actually experienced was a white-tiled tube approximately 12 feet in diameter, lit with colored LED strips that cycled through a palette of blues and purples with the cheerful insistence of a nightclub that had decided to go underground, traversed by a Tesla, driven by a young person who had been hired to do the driving that the autonomous future had not yet arrived to perform. The journey took approximately 2 minutes. The equivalent surface journey, during a busy convention day when the Las Vegas Convention Center's 3 million square feet of exhibition space disgorged its population simultaneously onto the surrounding streets, could take 15 or 20 minutes. By that measure, the loop worked. By the measure of what Elon Musk had originally described when he founded the Boring Company in 2016, standing in Los Angeles traffic by his own account, with the specific frustration of a man who had solved harder problems than urban congestion and could not understand why this particular problem remained unsolved, the Las Vegas loop was a narrower achievement than the vision had promised, and the distance between the promise and the delivery said something important about the specific character of Musk's relationship with the infrastructure of everyday life. The Boring Company had originated, like several of Musk's ventures, in a tweet, or rather, in the impulsive, unfiltered public declaration that Twitter had become, for Musk, the preferred medium for converting private frustration into organizational commitment. In December of 2016, stuck in traffic on a Los Angeles freeway, he had posted that he was going to build a tunnel boring machine and start digging. This was understood by most people who read it as the venting of a wealthy man with a social media account. It was understood by the people who worked for Musk as an organizational directive that would, within months, become a funded company with employees and a physical site and the serious capital-intensive apparatus of an enterprise that intended to do exactly what its founder had said it would do. The founding proposition was, in its engineering logic, not without merit. Urban traffic congestion was, by any objective measure, one of the most expensive and quality-of-life degrading problems in the modern city, the product of a two-dimensional infrastructure solution applied to a three-dimensional problem, the surface street grid struggling to accommodate vehicle volumes that it had never been designed to handle. The traditional response, building more surface roads, had been demonstrated by decades of transportation research to produce induced demand, new roads generating new trips until the new capacity was consumed. The alternative response, mass transit, required capital investments and political consensus that most American cities had proven congenitally incapable of assembling. The underground dimension, which subway systems had been exploiting since the 19th century, remained, in most American cities outside New York and a handful of others, essentially unused. Musk's specific contribution to this analysis was the proposition that tunneling had remained expensive, prohibitively expensive for the kind of network density that would make a meaningful difference to urban congestion. Not because tunneling was inherently expensive, but because the tunnel boring machine industry had not been subjected to the same kind of first principles engineering pressure that he had applied to rockets and batteries. The existing TBM technology was, in his analysis, decades old, undersized for the task, and organized around a cost structure that reflected the absence of serious competitive pressure rather than the inherent constraints of the physics. If you built a better boring machine, smaller, faster, cheaper to operate, capable of continuous boring rather than the stop-start cycle of conventional TBM operation, you could change the economics of tunneling in the same way he had changed the economics of orbital launch. The world into which the Las Vegas Loop opened in 2021 was one that had developed, during the pandemic year that preceded it, a newly urgent and newly anxious relationship with the question of how people move through cities. Urban transit ridership had collapsed during the lockdown period and had not recovered proportionally as restrictions lifted. A combination of remote work, safety concerns, and the behavioral repatterning that extended periods of isolation produce had changed the way significant portions of urban populations related to shared transportation infrastructure. Cities that had been planning transit expansions were recalibrating their projections. Autonomous vehicle timelines, which had been consistently optimistic throughout the 2010s, had been pushed back repeatedly enough that a certain institutional skepticism about the near-term arrival of full autonomy had become the default posture of serious transportation planners. The Las Vegas Loop existed at the intersection of all of these pressures, a project that had been conceived before the pandemic, permitted and constructed during it, and opened into a world whose relationship with the assumptions underlying its design had been substantially altered by 18 months of collective experience with exactly the kinds of disruption that the project had not been designed to address. The core conflict of the Boring Company's Las Vegas chapter was not primarily a technical one. The tunneling itself, the actual process of boring a 12-foot diameter tube through the substrate beneath the Las Vegas Convention Center and connecting it to stations at 3 points along the route, had proceeded with a speed and at a cost that the company used as evidence for its foundational claim about boring economics. The tunnel had been dug faster and cheaper than comparable transit tunnels in comparable cities, and the comparison was real, even if the scope of the comparison was more limited than the framing suggested. Boring a short, straight tunnel beneath the convention center complex in Las Vegas was a meaningfully different engineering challenge from boring the network of tunnels required to make a genuine impact on urban congestion in a city like Los Angeles or Chicago. The conflict was between the scale of the demonstration and the scale of the claim, between what had actually been built and what the Boring Company's promotional materials suggested it represented. The Las Vegas Loop served the Las Vegas Convention Center. It was useful, in the narrow and real sense that it made the experience of moving between buildings on a large convention campus faster and more convenient. It was not, by any reasonable analysis, a demonstration that underground autonomous vehicle networks could transform urban transportation at the scale that Musk's original vision had described. The gap between those two things, the thing that had been built and the thing that had been promised, was the gap that the Boring Company's critics and a growing number of transportation policy professionals had been measuring since the project's conception. The revealing action of this period was a decision made not in Las Vegas, but in Los Angeles, in the preceding years, that illuminated the specific pattern of Musk's engagement with the regulatory and political infrastructure of American cities. The Boring Company had, in 2018, received approval to begin construction of a test tunnel in Hawthorne, California, a modest short tunnel that served as a proof of concept for the boring technology and the vehicle transit system. The approval had been obtained through a process that the Boring Company's critics and several Hawthorne residents later argued had moved unusually quickly through the normal environmental and community review processes, and that had benefited from a relationship between the company and local officials that was closer than standard permitting procedures typically produced. When the company subsequently pursued permits for a longer tunnel system in Los Angeles, the Dugout Loop, intended to connect a parking area to Dodger Stadium, the project encountered the full weight of the public review process that the Hawthorne Tunnel had navigated more lightly, and ultimately withdrew its application. The withdrawal was presented as a business decision. It was also, for anyone tracking the pattern, a data point about the specific conditions under which the Boring Company's model worked, and the conditions under which it didn't. It worked when the regulatory environment was simplified, when the political relationships were favorable, and when the scope of the project was contained enough to avoid triggering the community opposition that larger, more disruptive infrastructure projects inevitably generated. It struggled when those conditions were absent. Las Vegas had provided those conditions. The Convention Center Authority was a willing partner. The underground route avoided the residential and commercial disruption that surface transit construction produced. The project scope was defined and finite. It was, in the taxonomy of infrastructure development, the best possible case, and it had worked. The person who had made it work, in the operational sense of navigating the construction management and stakeholder relationships that translated the engineering concept into a functioning system, was Steve Davis, the Boring Company's president, who had joined from SpaceX and who represented in the Boring Company's organizational life the same function that Shotwell served at SpaceX and that Baglino served at Tesla, the operational intelligence that converted Musk's vision into a managed process. Davis was, by the accounts of people who worked with him, an engineer of genuine capability and a manager of genuine competence, and his relationship with Musk during the Las Vegas project was the productive working relationship of people who shared a clear objective and complementary skills for achieving it. What Davis could not provide, what no operational executive in any of Musk's organizations could provide, because it was a structural feature of the ventures rather than an organizational deficiency, was the modulation of the gap between the promise and the delivery. The Boring Company had been presented to the public and to the cities that were evaluating it as a potential transit solution, as a technology that would transform urban mobility. The Las Vegas Loop was a useful amenity for convention attendees. These were not the same thing, and the accumulated weight of the gap between them was producing in the transportation policy community a skepticism about the company's larger ambitions that the success of the Las Vegas project, precisely because of its limited scope, had not resolved. The tunnels were real. The LED lights were cheerful. The Tesla drivers were polite, and the rides were fast, and the passengers who experienced them were, in the aggregate, pleased. By the narrow measure of what had been built and what it accomplished, the Las Vegas Loop was a success. Musk attended the opening with the satisfaction of a man who had said he would do something and had done it, and spoke about the future of the Boring Company with the forward-looking confidence of someone for whom the distance between the current demonstration and the ultimate vision was simply a matter of continued execution. In the offices of urban planning departments in Chicago, Miami, Fort Lauderdale, and San Antonio, cities that had signed agreements with the Boring Company to explore loop projects of their own, officials were running the numbers on proposals that were, in some cases, considerably more ambitious than the Las Vegas installation, and discovering that the economics that had worked beneath a convention center in the Nevada desert produced different results when applied to the route lengths and passenger volumes that a genuine urban transit system required, and that the questions they were sending to the Boring Company's offices were taking longer to receive answers than the timeline of their own planning processes could comfortably accommodate. And in a different part of the same man's attention, the part that was always simultaneously managing 5 crises across 5 companies while appearing, to people who met him, to be entirely focused on the conversation in front of him, Musk was reading Twitter engagement data with the specific interest of a man who had long used the platform as both a tool and a weapon, and was beginning to think thoughts about the platform itself that were not, in December of 2021, yet fully formed, but that were moving, with the inevitability of a conclusion, whose premises had already been accepted, toward an action that would make the foam pad on the factory floor, and the bankruptcy email, and the pig with the chip in her brain seem, in retrospect, like the quiet prelude to the loudest thing he had ever done. Chapter 60. Personal Life, Grimes and the Birth of XAASHE. The joke was about artificial intelligence, and it landed. This was, in itself, not remarkable. Jokes about artificial intelligence were abundant in 2018, proliferating across the internet with the self-congratulatory density of humor produced by people who believed that understanding a reference was the same as understanding what the reference pointed toward. What was remarkable was the specific joke, and the specific person who had made it, and the fact that Elon Musk, scrolling through whatever corner of the internet had surfaced it, stopped, read it twice, and discovered that the person who had made it had arrived at the same AI-related pun he had been developing independently from a completely different direction, through a completely different life. The person was Claire Boucher. The world knew her as Grimes. Musk reached out. She responded. The conversation that followed, conducted initially through the frictionless anonymity of online messaging, the medium that had always suited Musk's social instincts better than the physical performance of charm, moved with a speed that surprised both of them, in the accounts they later gave of it separately, because it moved at the speed of genuine recognition rather than the speed of romantic strategy. They were talking about ideas, about simulation theory, about the philosophy of mind, about the specific character of the anxiety that attended the development of artificial general intelligence, and whether that anxiety was rational or whether rationality itself was an insufficient framework for evaluating existential risk. They were, in short, talking about the things that Musk talked about when he was most himself, not the CEO performing vision for investors or the celebrity managing a public persona, but the person who had spent 30 years building toward a set of propositions about the future that most people found either inspiring or alarming and very rarely merely interesting. Grimes found them interesting. More than interesting. She had arrived at adjacent propositions through the entirely different methodology of an artist who processed the world through sound and image, and the specific oblique intelligence of someone who had taught herself to think by consuming ideas rather than credentials. She had no engineering training and no business formation. She had instead a mind that moved sideways through problems in ways that occasionally produced, by a different route, the same destination that Musk's linear intensity was pursuing. The collision of these two cognitive styles, his systematized, engineering inflected, forward projected, hers associative, aesthetic, temporally diffuse, produced something that neither of them had anticipated and that neither of them in the years that followed would find easy to sustain. The world into which their relationship became public knowledge in May of 2018 was a world that had developed, in the preceding 2 years, an extraordinary appetite for Musk as a cultural phenomenon, an appetite that had moved well beyond the business press and the technology community into the general culture in ways that made his personal life a subject of public interest at a scale he had not previously experienced. The Tesla short seller wars were at their most intense. The Joe Rogan appearance, in which he smoked marijuana on camera with the slightly stunned expression of a man who had agreed to something without fully modeling its consequences, was still months away. But the cultural machinery that processed celebrity had already identified him as something more legible than a technology executive, something that fit the template of the visionary eccentric in ways that made him, for better and worse, interesting to people who had no particular stake in electric vehicles or orbital mechanics. Grimes occupied a different but adjacent space in the same cultural landscape. She had built across a decade of electronic music and deliberately confrontational public persona an artistic identity that was genuinely sui generis, drawing on science fiction, medieval imagery, internet culture, and a relationship with her own celebrity that was ironic and sincere simultaneously, often in the same gesture. She was not famous in the way that pop stars are famous, which is to say her fame was intense within its territory and relatively invisible outside it. The territory, as it happened, overlapped significantly with the segment of the culture that was most engaged with the ideas Musk was associated with, the techno-futurist, anxious, space-enthusiastic community that had made him its unlikely prophet. Their appearance together at the Met Gala in May 2018, she in an ornate algorithmically generated dress by designer Matthias Sibik, he in a conventional tuxedo, looking slightly as if he had been placed in the frame by a production assistant who had made an interesting creative choice, produced a cultural moment that was processed depending on the processor as romantic, bizarre, calculated, or some combination of all three. The internet generated think pieces. The celebrity press generated speculation. The financial press generated with the specific humor of a community that had learned to treat Musk's personal life as a variable in its models, various assessments of what the relationship signaled about his state of mind at a moment when Tesla's stock was doing things that required explanation. Musk, characteristically, said very little about any of it. He had learned, through the expensive tuition of his marriages to Justine and his twice-repeated relationship with Tallulah Riley, that his personal life did not remain personal once it became public, and that the gap between the person he was in private, attentive, curious, capable of sustained tenderness in the specific contexts where his attention was not consumed by the operational demands of 5 simultaneous companies, and the person the public had constructed from his professional behavior was too wide to be easily bridged by anything, he said. He had found in Grimes something that he did not discuss publicly, not because he was protecting it from scrutiny, but because the language for discussing it did not fit comfortably into any of the registers he typically deployed. The core conflict of this chapter in Musk's personal biography was not the conflict between two incompatible people. The relationship was, by the accounts of both participants in their various public statements, genuinely meaningful in ways that neither of them pretended otherwise. It was the conflict between the life that meaningful relationship requires, presence, continuity, the ordinary accretion of shared experience that builds the specific intimacy of people who have been in each other's company long enough to know each other's rhythms, and the life that Musk was actually living, which was not organized around any of those requirements and could not be reorganized around them without dismantling the architecture of purpose that gave the rest of his existence its coherence. He had been through this conflict before. He had been through it twice with the same woman, and once more with another, and the pattern that the three relationships described was not the pattern of a man who failed at love for lack of feeling, but of a man who failed at love for lack of available surface area. There was simply not enough of him, in the quotidian sense, not enough hours, not enough unoccupied attention, not enough of the unscheduled presence that intimate life requires, to sustain the kind of partnership that another person's needs, however reasonable, would eventually demand. Grimes understood this, or believed she understood it, in the early phase of the relationship, with the understanding of an artist who had organized her own life around a creative practice sufficiently consuming that she had some experiential access to what it meant to be unavailable to the people who loved you. She had, in this sense, more tolerance for the specific character of his absence than most people in his life had managed. She had also, as an artist who processed experience through her work, a different relationship with solitude and with the management of her own interior life than the more conventionally oriented partners of his past. Their son, Xaashi, was born on May 4, 2020, in the deepest weeks of the pandemic lockdown, into a world that had suspended its ordinary operations and retreated into the domestic sphere with a totality that no living person had experienced before. The birth was announced, in the manner of all significant events in Musk's life in the social media era, on Twitter, and the name, parsed and debated and misread and misrepresented in approximately every way that a name can be misread and misrepresented, became the subject of a cultural conversation that lasted for weeks and that said more about the public's relationship with Musk than it said about the child or the parents. The name was, in its components, a collaboration. Grimes had proposed the aesthetic and phonetic structure, the X, the A12 reference to the Lockheed Archangel I-2 aircraft, which she described as her favorite aircraft, and which she associated with certain qualities of speed and elegance that she wanted the name to carry. The she represented the Roman numeral modification that California's naming laws required. The state did not permit numbers in legal names, which was the kind of regulatory constraint that Musk typically found irritating, and that in this case produced by the substitution of she for 12, a name that was if anything more elaborate than its original conception. Musk had participated in the naming with the enthusiasm of someone who found the idea of encoding meaning and reference into a name, making it a compressed artifact of intellectual content rather than a conventional social signal, entirely congruent with his own approach to naming things. His rockets were named Falcon and Dragon. His cars were named with letters and numbers that formed, in sequence, a word. His child's name was, in this light, simply the most personal expression of the same instinct. The revealing action of this period, the moment that functions as a keyhole into the larger character of both the relationship and the man, occurred not at the birth but in the weeks preceding it, during which Musk was, by multiple accounts, genuinely and visibly trying to be present in a way that his history suggested he found difficult. People who interacted with him during this period noted a quality in him that they associated less with the operational Musk, the one who ran meetings and made decisions and processed information at the speed of a system under load, and more with something quieter and more uncertain, the quality of a man who was aware that the thing that was about to happen required a version of him that he was not entirely confident he could produce on demand. He was, in his own description, in later interviews, terrified, not of the birth, but of the specific kind of love that the birth would produce, the involuntary, unconditional attachment to another person that he had experienced 5 times before with his children from his marriage to Justine, and that he knew from that experience was not compatible with the emotional economy he had built for himself. That economy was organized around the substitution of purpose for vulnerability, around the proposition that if the mission was large enough and important enough and consuming enough, the absence of the ordinary emotional textures of human life was not a deprivation but a trade. Children complicated that proposition. They always had. They complicated it because they did not care about the mission, and because caring about them required exactly the quality of unguarded emotional exposure that the mission's architecture was designed, whether deliberately or not, to prevent. Grimes gave birth during a pandemic. Musk was present. The child was named X. The world, in the middle of its own crisis, briefly paused to process this information and then returned to its crisis, and the small family in its Bel Air residence, temporary, as all of Musk's domestic arrangements had been temporary, organized around the needs of whoever was in it without the accumulating permanence of a home that was meant to last, began the ordinary, extraordinary process of becoming acquainted with a new person. Daughter Exa Dark Sidriel, called Y in the family shorthand, followed in December 2021, born via surrogate. Her existence disclosed months after the fact in a manner that reflected both the couple's relationship with privacy and the specific complexity of their relationship with each other, which had by that point moved through a separation and a reconciliation, and was navigating with the difficulty that all serious relationships navigate when the people in them are living lives of extraordinary external demand, the question of what it meant to be committed to someone you could not reliably be present for. Sun Techno Mechanicus, Tao, arrived via surrogate in 2022, also disclosed after the fact. The third child of a relationship that had by then officially ended and been succeeded by something that neither participant seemed to have a precise word for. A bond that was neither romantic partnership in the conventional sense nor simple co-parenting, but something that occupied the space between those categories in the way that Musk's most important relationships had always occupied spaces between categories. What the relationship with Grimes revealed in the end was not a new version of Musk, but a more clearly illuminated version of the existing one. A man whose capacity for genuine connection was real, and whose capacity for sustained presence was not, and who had found in Grimes a partner whose own complexity and creative self-sufficiency had made the gap between those two capacities more tolerable for longer than it had been in any of his previous partnerships. The names they gave their children, dense with reference, resistant to convention, encoding in 3 syllables entire libraries of aesthetic and intellectual intention, were the most intimate artifacts of what the relationship actually was. A collaboration between two people who thought in systems and expressed themselves in signals, and who had produced in the ordinary biological miracle of children, the most human possible consequence of an unusually inhuman kind of love. In the autumn of 2021, as Xa took his first steps in whatever residence his father was currently treating as primary, and as Grimes released music that processed the experience of the relationship in the oblique beautiful language of her art, and as the relationship continued its complicated navigation between connection and distance, Musk was reading something on his phone that had nothing to do with any of it, and everything to do with the next chapter of who he was about to become. A chapter that would begin with a single word typed into a search bar: Twitter.